I spent 8 years ghostwriting the brilliant strategies that built my wife's career while I stayed home to raise our children. Tonight, she stood in a $3,000 designer dress at an exclusive country club and told 200 corporate elites that I was a complete failure who had never accomplished a single thing in my life. The entire ballroom erupted into laughter at my expense, but they all stopped laughing 20 minutes later when her billionaire boss walked through the heavy oak doors, ignored her outstretched hand completely, and handed me the most lucrative international contract in the history of their firm. My name is Thomas, and I am 38 years old. I am going to tell you how the ultimate public humiliation became the exact moment I dismantled my wife's fake empire and built a real one of my own. The Oak Ridge Country Club was suffocating in its forced elegance. The air smelled of expensive prime rib roasted garlic and the kind of heavy floral perfume people wear when they want you to know exactly how much money they spend at boutique counters. Crystal glasses clinked continuously as waiters in crisp white jackets glided silently across the polished hardwood floors, carrying silver trays of champagne. This was the absolute pinnacle of modern corporate society in our city, and tonight the entire spectacle was focused entirely on my wife. Caroline stood at the head table bathed in the warm golden glow of the overhead spotlight. She was 36 years old, and tonight she was officially accepting her highly publicized promotion to Vice President of Acquisitions. She wore a tailored silk gown that cost more than most people make in a month of hard labor, and her smile was perfectly practiced. It was the radiant, untouchable smile of a woman who believed she had finally conquered the world and left the peasants behind. I sat at the very end of the head table, completely swallowed by the shadows of massive floral centerpieces. I was wearing a simple dark suit that I had purchased 5 years ago. It was clean and perfectly pressed, but in a massive room full of custom Italian tailoring and designer labels, I might as well have been wearing rags. That was exactly how Caroline had planned it. She had specifically arranged the seating chart to place me as far away from the center of attention as physically possible, while still maintaining the illusion of a supportive marriage. I was supposed to be the invisible husband, the quiet background character who stayed completely out of the way while the real adults handled the important business of running the world. Sitting directly to my left was Caroline's older sister, Sarah, and her husband, Brent. They were the perfect reflection of everything Caroline desperately aspired to be. Sarah was dripping in heavy diamond jewelry that I knew for an absolute fact Brent had purchased on high-interest credit cards just to keep up appearances. Brent was a mid-level commercial real estate agent who walked around acting like he owned half the state. They spent the entire first hour of the formal dinner whispering cruel, mean-spirited jokes to each other and making sure I could hear every single word. Brent leaned heavily over his plate of untouched food and smirked at me, showing his perfectly bleached teeth. He asked if I was enjoying the free premium meal, since it was probably the best food I would eat all year on my non-existent salary. He laughed loudly at his own joke and took a long, careless sip of his expensive wine. Sarah chimed in immediately, never missing an opportunity to twist the knife. She adjusted her diamond necklace and told me I should be taking detailed notes on how truly successful people operate in the real world. She said it was a terrible shame that Caroline had outgrown me so completely, but that happens when one person is a fiercely driven executive and the other is just a glorified domestic babysitter who lacks ambition. I did not say a single word in response to their venom. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead and let their insults slide off me like rain. I knew the dark truth about their crippling financial situation, and I knew the solid truth about my own life. I did not need to prove my worth to hollow people who built their entire identities on mounting debt and fragile social illusions, but the real targeted attack was yet to come. The massive room grew completely quiet as the regional director tapped a silver spoon against his crystal glass and formally introduced Caroline. The applause that followed was deafening, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Caroline walked gracefully to the oak podium and adjusted the microphone with the confidence of a seasoned politician. She looked out over the sea of wealthy corporate faces and began her speech. She started with the usual nauseating fake humility. She thanked the board of directors and the executive management team for recognizing her unique vision. She talked endlessly about the grueling midnight hours she had put into securing the massive new European merger. She spoke passionately about the complex global market analysis she had presented to the aggressive board of directors last quarter. I sat in the cold shadows and listened to her take full, unadulterated credit for my life's work. I was a brilliant international trade consultant before I gave up my own successful boutique firm to fully support her towering ambitions. I knew the global financial markets better than anyone sitting in that room. When Caroline was crying in our home office, struggling to understand the basic foundational mechanics of international corporate acquisitions, I was the one who stayed up until 3 a.m. drafting her proposals line by line. I wrote the exact market analysis she was currently bragging about on stage. I quietly structured the very merger that won her this massive promotion. She was the beautiful, polished face of the operation, but I was the invisible architect holding the entire structure together. While she was out at endless networking galas, drinking expensive champagne and shaking hands, I was sitting at our modest kitchen table, making sure our 2 children were actually being raised with real values. I dedicated my days to giving them an intellectual foundation she never cared to provide. I took complete control of their education, ensuring they were fully trilingual. I spent thousands of hours teaching them to read and speak perfect English, Italian, and German, because I wanted them to understand the vast history and culture of the world. Beyond that, I rigorously taught them Mandarin. I pushed them to master the complex tones and characters because I knew with absolute certainty that Mandarin is the highly strategic language of the future global economy. I sacrificed my own professional identity so she could shine brightly, and so our children would never have to be raised by a rotating cast of paid strangers. Caroline's sharp voice echoed through the ballroom, pulling me violently back to the present moment. She was reaching the grand emotional climax of her carefully rehearsed speech. She smiled warmly, placing a hand over her heart, and told the crowd that immense success is never truly achieved alone. She said everyone needs a solid rock to stand on and someone to remind them of what happens if they ever stop climbing the ladder. She paused for dramatic effect, letting the silence hang in the air, and then she looked directly at me. The lighting technician shifted the spotlight, slightly illuminating my face for the entire room to scrutinize. I expected a standard polite acknowledgement, a brief, courteous thank you to the supportive husband who held down the fort. Instead, she delivered a calculated and utterly brutal execution of my pride in front of the most powerful people in the city. She leaned closely into the microphone, and her voice dripped with thick, condescending pity. She told the quiet crowd that she wanted to specifically thank her husband, Thomas. She said Thomas was the perfect, glaring example of why she works so tirelessly hard every single day. She let out a small, theatrical sigh and said it takes a massive amount of strength to carry a household entirely on your own shoulders. She told 200 of her elite peers that she had to become a vice president because she was tragically married to a man who had never accomplished a single meaningful thing in his entire life. She boldly stated that Thomas was perfectly content to just stay home and be a monumental failure, and that watching him completely give up on his own life was her absolute biggest motivation to succeed. The heavy silence in the ballroom lasted for exactly 1 terrifying second before the laughter began. It started near the front row of executives and spread backward like a vicious wildfire. 200 people in expensive suits and designer gowns were laughing openly and loudly at me. The collective sound was deafening. It was a sycophantic, cruel laughter from ambitious people who desperately wanted to please the new vice president by joining in on her cruel joke. Sarah bumped my shoulder hard with hers and let out a sharp, mean cackle. She leaned in and whispered that Caroline had finally told the brutal truth in public and that I deserved every single humiliating second of it for holding her sister back. Brent chuckled loudly and proudly raised his crystal glass toward the podium as if formally toasting my absolute destruction. I sat perfectly still like a statue carved from ice. My facial expression did not change by a single fraction. I did not blush with shame, and I did not look away in defeat. I met Caroline's eyes squarely across the massive room. She was smiling a genuine, triumphant, vicious smile. She truly thought she had permanently broken me. She believed she had put me in my pathetic place forever, proving to all her wealthy colleagues that she was the absolute, unchecked power in our relationship. She had no idea that she had just made the single biggest catastrophic mistake of her entire life. My total silence and lack of reaction infuriated the toxic people sitting around me. Brent leaned in much closer, his hot breath smelling strongly of alcohol and expensive seasoned steak. He demanded to know why I was not running out of the room crying like a beaten dog. He told me I was a deeply pathetic excuse for a man to just sit there and quietly take that kind of massive public humiliation. He said if he were me, he would crawl directly under the table and never show his worthless face in polite society again. I turned my head very slowly and looked Brent directly in his bloodshot eyes. I did not raise my voice or show any anger. I spoke with a quiet, cold, calm certainty that made him blink rapidly in sudden surprise. I told him that polite society is just a thin, pathetic mask for weak people who have hidden second mortgages, massive credit card debt, and zero actual talent to offer the world. I watched the fake tan color drain instantly from Brent's face as I mentioned the second mortgage. He knew that I knew the dark truth about his failing finances. He snapped his mouth shut and looked away, gripping his wine glass until his knuckles turned white. I turned my attention calmly back to the stage. Caroline was wrapping up her devastating speech to thunderous roaring applause. She raised her glass high, and the entire room immediately stood up for a massive standing ovation. I remained completely seated. Out of 200 people, I was the only person in the entire ballroom who firmly refused to stand for her. The anger building inside me was not a fiery, explosive, blind rage. It was cold, surgical, and highly calculating. For 8 long years, I had severely compromised my own massive potential out of misplaced love and blind loyalty. I had deliberately ignored the glaring red flags. I had foolishly overlooked her rapidly growing obsession with status titles and designer brands. I had convinced myself that she was just stressed from climbing the vicious corporate ladder. But tonight, the false illusion of our marriage was completely and permanently shattered. She did not just lack basic gratitude. She actively despised me for the very sacrifices that had single-handedly allowed her to succeed. The deafening applause finally died down, and the live string quartet in the corner of the room began to play a soft, upbeat classical melody. The formal dinner portion of the evening was transitioning smoothly into a lively networking reception. Waiters immediately began clearing the china plates and pouring fresh rounds of expensive champagne. People were eagerly leaving their tables to flock toward Caroline, desperate to shake hands and ingratiate themselves with the powerful new vice president. I placed my linen napkin neatly on the table and stood up to my full height. I calmly adjusted the cuffs of my old suit. I did not feel humiliated anymore. I felt entirely free. The heavy, invisible chains of my deep loyalty to her had just been completely dissolved in front of 200 witnesses. I stepped away from the table, leaving Sarah and Brent sitting in completely stunned, resentful silence. I needed fresh air. I needed to formulate my next immediate move. I walked slowly and deliberately toward the heavy oak doors that led to the main lobby of the country club. The thick, rich carpet muffled my confident footsteps. A few people glanced at me as I passed, their eyes filled with thinly veiled amusement or outright condescending pity. They confidently assumed they saw a defeated, weak man running away from his wildly successful, dominant wife. They thought they saw a total failure, retreating into the dark shadows where he rightfully belonged. I pushed through the large, heavy wooden doors and stepped into the quiet grand lobby. The air out here was significantly cooler, and the oppressive, chaotic noise of the ballroom was immediately reduced to a dull, distant murmur. I took a deep, cleansing breath and pulled my phone from my pocket. I needed to quickly check on my children. They were perfectly safe at home with a trusted long-term sitter diligently practicing their language lessons, but they were the only pure thing that mattered to me now. Before I could even unlock my glowing screen, the heavy ballroom doors swung open violently behind me. I turned slowly to see Sarah and Brent marching aggressively toward me. They had intentionally followed me out into the empty lobby, and they did not look like they were finished with their toxic cruelty. Sarah's face was aggressively twisted into a nasty, superior sneer, and Brent was clutching a thick, legal manila folder tightly in his hands. This was not a spontaneous family confrontation born out of the heat of the moment. This was a highly calculated legal ambush. Sarah crossed her arms sharply and told me with a vicious smirk that Caroline was far too important and wealthy now to deal with dead weight holding her back anymore. She proudly announced that the humiliating speech in the ballroom was just the beginning of my absolute destruction. Brent stepped forward aggressively and shoved the heavy manila folder hard against my chest, forcing me to take it to keep it from hitting the floor. He told me with a dark laugh that it was finally time to finalize the trash removal. I looked down at the folder in my hands. The heavy legal paper felt cold against my skin. The conflict was escalating much faster than I had anticipated, but I felt absolutely no fear. I felt the absolute unshakable certainty of a man who knows he firmly holds the only foundation of a massive building that is about to completely collapse. The public humiliation at the head table was officially over. The brutal private war for my financial and personal survival was just beginning, and they had absolutely no idea who they were actually fighting. The clapping washed over the ballroom in crashing waves. Every single person in that lavish space stood on their feet to honor a woman who had just publicly executed my dignity. Caroline remained on the stage. She soaked in the admiration with her head held high and a brilliant smile plastered across her face. I watched as her colleagues rushed forward to shake her hand. They wanted to be near the power she now commanded. Not a single person looked back at the shadows where I sat. I was entirely invisible to them. That was exactly how Caroline wanted it. But as I sat there, listening to the endless cheering, I did not feel the crushing defeat she expected me to feel. Instead, my mind went completely quiet. The blinding rage I felt just moments ago began to settle into a cold, hard clarity. I looked at the $3,000 dress she was wearing. I looked at the crystal chandeliers reflecting off her diamond earrings. She truly believed she had earned all of it by herself. She had convinced herself that her brilliant mind and her relentless ambition were the sole reasons she was standing on that stage. But I knew the absolute truth. The foundation of her entire shiny empire was built squarely on my back. 8 years ago, the world looked very different. I was not a silent background character. I was the founder and lead strategist of my own boutique international trade consulting firm. We were small, but we were fierce. I had built a reputation in the financial district for seeing global market trends months before the powerful corporate giants even woke up to them. My days were filled with high-stakes negotiations and endless strategy meetings. I was on a trajectory to become one of the most sought-after consultants in the industry. I loved my work. I loved the thrill of untangling complex international trade laws and finding the hidden paths to lucrative profits. Caroline was working as a mid-level manager back then. She was fiercely ambitious, but she lacked the elite credentials required to break into the upper echelons of corporate management. She came to me one evening with tears in her eyes and a brochure for an Ivy League Master of Business Administration program. She told me it was her ultimate dream. She said it was the only way she could ever truly achieve her limitless potential. But the tuition was astronomical. Taking out loans would have crippled our financial future for decades. We sat at our small kitchen table for hours looking at the numbers. That was the night I made the single biggest sacrifice of my entire life. I did not just offer to help her pay for it. I completely dissolved my own thriving business. I liquidated every single asset I had built. I closed my firm and I wrote a huge cash check to cover her entire Ivy League tuition in full. I ensured that she walked into that prestigious university with absolutely zero financial burden. I gave up my own glowing professional future so that she could graduate completely debt-free and launch her career into the stratosphere. It was a choice made out of absolute love and blind loyalty. I believed we were building a united future together. I thought her success would be our success. I thought giving up my dreams was just a temporary pause so that she could catch up to my level of professional achievement. I truly believed that once she reached the top, she would reach down and pull me up beside her. I was young and foolish enough to think that endless sacrifice was the exact same thing as unconditional love. I traded my tailored suits for sweatpants and traded the high-stakes boardrooms for our living room floor. While Caroline spent the next 8 years climbing the corporate ladder, I stayed home to raise our 2 children. She was constantly attending glamorous networking galas, flying across the country for exclusive summits, and drinking expensive wine with powerful executives. She was rarely home before 8 at night, and she spent her weekends glued to her phone managing corporate crises. I was the one who was actually there for our kids. I was the one who made their breakfasts, packed their lunches, and walked them to school every single morning. I was the one who sat by their beds when they were sick with fevers in the middle of the night, wiping their foreheads with cool, damp cloths. I became their entire world because their mother was too busy conquering hers. I memorized their favorite books, and I knew exactly how to make them laugh when they were having terrible days. But I did not just keep them safe and fed. I viewed my role as a father as the most important job I had ever held. I applied the exact same relentless strategic focus to their upbringing that I had once applied to global trade markets. I knew the world was becoming increasingly competitive and interconnected. I refused to let my children grow up unprepared. I wanted them to have an unshakable intellectual foundation. I dedicated thousands of hours to their linguistic education. By the time they were in elementary school, I had personally ensured they were completely trilingual. I sat with them every single afternoon at our kitchen table, working through complex grammar and vocabulary. I taught them to read, write, and speak perfect English, Italian, and German. I wanted them to have access to the deep, rich history of European culture and philosophy. I wanted them to understand that the world was vast and full of different perspectives. It required endless patience and rigorous daily practice, but I never gave up on them. I watched with immense pride as their young minds absorbed the difficult languages. But I did not stop there. I knew that the traditional languages of the past were not enough to secure their future in a rapidly changing economy. I understood the shifting dynamics of global trade better than anyone sitting in that ballroom tonight. I knew with absolute certainty that Mandarin was the strategic language of the future. It was the absolute key to unlocking the vast economic powerhouses of the East. So I implemented a rigorous daily Mandarin curriculum. I patiently guided them through the incredibly difficult tonal pronunciations and the complex written characters. When Caroline complained that I was pushing them too hard, I quietly ignored her. I knew I was giving my children a permanent advantage in life that no amount of money could ever buy. While she was out chasing hollow corporate titles and kissing up to executives, I was busy building 2 brilliant, capable human beings who would actually be ready to navigate the entire world. I took immense pride in their progress. My children were becoming sharp, empathetic, and deeply intelligent global citizens. They were my ultimate accomplishment, and I did it all without any help from the woman who just called me a failure on stage. She never bothered to ask them how to say a single word in Mandarin. She never bothered to sit with them and listen to them speak German. She simply viewed them as accessories to her perfect corporate life. But my invisible labor was not just confined to raising our children. Caroline's meteoric rise through the corporate ranks was not fueled by her own brilliant insights. It was fueled directly by my brain. Whenever she faced an insurmountable hurdle at work, she brought it home to me. When her firm was completely stumped by a volatile European market shift, she sat at our dining table crying and panicking. She had absolutely no idea how to structure the deal or how to navigate the complex international tariffs that were actively blocking her department from moving forward. She was completely out of her depth and terrified of being exposed as a fraud. I was the one who stepped in and saved her. I was the one who stayed awake until 3 a.m, fueled by black coffee, drafting her complex market analyses. I took her scattered, incomplete data and wove it into masterful strategic proposals that guaranteed unprecedented returns for her clients. I wrote the exact acquisition strategies that her billionaire chief executive officer praised as visionary. I ghost-wrote every single major presentation she delivered over the past 5 years. She would take my carefully crafted documents, print them on expensive corporate letterhead, and present them as her own flawless work. She never once credited me, not in private and certainly not in public. She absorbed my intellect and used it as the fuel for her own unstoppable ascent. Every promotion she received, every lucrative bonus that hit her bank account, every ounce of respect she commanded in that ballroom tonight was directly manufactured by the husband she just called a complete failure. I was the invisible architect holding up the entire structure of her career. She was nothing more than the beautiful, polished face of my internal operations. I spent years quietly feeding her the correct answers because I wanted my wife to succeed. I wanted our family to have financial security, and I wanted her to feel powerful and fulfilled. I willingly sacrificed my own ego so she could stand proudly in the spotlight and receive the endless applause she so desperately craved. I never asked for public recognition or expensive gifts in return for my heavy intellectual labor. I only ever asked for basic respect and a genuine, loving partnership. But the absolute power and the ridiculous wealth had completely corrupted her mind. The woman I married was completely gone and replaced by a toxic corporate monster. I watched her now as she laughed loudly with a group of senior vice presidents holding her crystal glass of champagne. She looked so perfectly convinced of her own independent greatness. She had completely rewritten the history of our marriage in her own mind. She genuinely believed that she had carried dead weight for 8 years. She had completely forgotten the man who handed her a huge pile of cash for her degree. She had completely forgotten the father who raised her children while she chased status. She had completely forgotten the ghostwriter who actually built the strategies that won her this ridiculous promotion. I took a slow, deep breath as the classical music swelled in the background. The pain in my chest was completely gone now. It was entirely replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. She had wanted to play a ruthless corporate game, and she had just made the opening move by destroying my reputation in front of 200 people. She was about to learn a very hard lesson about loyalty and betrayal, but she had made a fatal miscalculation. She forgot that she was picking a fight with the absolute architect of her own success. She forgot that a towering building can easily collapse if the person holding the foundation decides to finally walk away. I remained in the cold shadows watching her celebrate her fake victory, and I prepared to take back everything I had built. The applause continued to ring out through the room, but it sounded hollow to me now. It was just the sound of 200 fools clapping for a complete illusion. I slowly adjusted my cheap suit jacket and kept my eyes locked directly on her glowing face. The 8 years of quiet sacrifice were officially over. The invisible husband was about to step directly into the light and completely dismantle the fragile glass castle she had built on top of my name. She thought this night was the peak of her entire existence. She believed that she had permanently established herself as a titan of industry who could never be touched by a peasant like me. She had absolutely no idea that her glorious career was already completely over. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung shut, cutting off the deafening sound of the cheering crowd and the live string quartet. The grand lobby of the country club was completely silent. It was a massive, cavernous room filled with towering marble pillars, antique oil paintings, and crystal chandeliers that cast a cold, bright light. The air out here was significantly cooler, and it smelled strongly of fresh white orchids and expensive lemon floor wax. I took a slow, deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. I needed a moment to process the absolute betrayal that had just taken place on that stage. I needed to gather my thoughts and figure out my next immediate move. But before I could even take a single step toward the glass front exit, the heavy wooden doors violently burst open behind me. I turned around slowly. Sarah and Brent were marching aggressively across the thick, ornate Persian carpet. They had intentionally followed me out of the ballroom, and they did not look like they were finished with their toxic cruelty. This was not a spontaneous family confrontation born out of the heat of the moment or the alcohol they had consumed at dinner. I could tell by the stiff, aggressive way they moved that this was a highly calculated legal ambush. Sarah was walking slightly ahead of her husband. She was wearing a tight silver designer dress, and she was dripping in heavy diamond jewelry that sparkled under the lobby lights. I knew for an absolute fact that Brent had purchased those diamonds on high-interest credit cards just to keep up appearances at these elite corporate events. They were a couple secretly drowning in massive debt, but tonight they walked toward me with the arrogant confidence of billionaires. Brent stepped up right beside her, matching her aggressive pace. He was a mid-level commercial real estate agent who always acted like he owned the entire city. His face was flushed red from premium wine and the excitement of watching my public execution. Sarah crossed her arms sharply and looked me up and down with absolute unfiltered disgust. She let out a vicious mocking laugh that echoed loudly off the polished marble walls. She told me I was completely pathetic for just standing up and walking away from the head table. She said Caroline had finally told the brutal, honest truth in front of 200 powerful people, and I was too much of a coward to even defend my own honor. She sneered and added that I had no honor left to defend anyway. Brent stepped forward, aggressively closing the distance between us. He shoved a thick, heavy manila folder hard against my chest. He pushed it with enough sudden force that I had to grab it with both hands just to keep it from hitting the floor. He told me it was finally time to finalize the trash removal. He laughed loudly at his own terrible joke and told me I needed to pay very close attention to what was printed on the pages inside that folder. He said my free ride was officially over and the real world was finally knocking on my door. I looked down at the heavy legal document in my hands. The paper felt cold and stiff against my fingers. I slowly opened the thick cover and read the first page. It was a ruthless, comprehensive post-nuptial agreement drafted by one of the most expensive and aggressive law firms in the state. The legal jargon was incredibly dense, packed with complex clauses and stipulations, but the underlying message was completely clear. Caroline was officially cutting me out of her life, and she was using a team of corporate lawyers to take every single thing we owned. Sarah took a step closer, completely invading my personal space. Her heavy floral perfume was overwhelming and suffocating. She pointed a sharp manicured finger directly at my chest and explicitly told me that Caroline had completely outgrown me. She said her sister was now a powerful, highly respected vice president of acquisitions who was going to be making millions of dollars and networking exclusively with the global elite. She looked at my simple, dark suit with sheer contempt. She said I looked like a cheap local handyman who had accidentally wandered into an exclusive country club looking for the service entrance. She told me I was a heavy iron anchor dragging her brilliant sister down, and it was finally time to permanently cut the rope. I kept my eyes firmly focused on the legal document in my hands, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me react to their insults. The financial clauses on the second page were absolutely devastating. The agreement demanded that I immediately surrender any and all legal rights to Caroline's new corporate equity and stock options. It stated in plain, aggressive language that I would not touch a single penny of her future earnings, her massive new executive bonuses, or her retirement accounts. But the ruthless greed did not stop there. The document also demanded that I sign over my entire half of our family home. The beautiful house where I had raised our 2 children for the past 8 years. The home I had meticulously maintained, repaired and cleaned every single day while she was out building the towering career that I had secretly orchestrated from the shadows. Brent leaned heavily over my right shoulder, pointing a thick finger at the signature line at the bottom of the final page. His hot breath smelled strongly of expensive seasoned steak and aged wine. He told me I needed to find a pen and sign the document right now before I left the building. He said Caroline was being extremely generous by not calling security to throw me out onto the street in front of all her colleagues. He proudly claimed that the legal team had drawn up these exact papers weeks ago, and they were just waiting for the perfect moment to deliver them. That specific realization hit me like a physical punch to the center of my stomach. Weeks ago, while I was sitting at our small kitchen table late at night running on black coffee and ghostwriting the incredibly complex international trade strategies that ultimately secured her this massive promotion, she was actively meeting with ruthless divorce attorneys. She was smiling at me across the dinner table, asking me to review her global market analysis while she was secretly plotting my absolute financial destruction. She had used my sharp intellect to climb all the way to the top of the mountain, and now that she had reached the peak, she was trying to violently push me off the cliff. I looked up from the heavy document and met Sarah's cold eyes. I kept my voice perfectly calm and level. I asked her exactly what would happen if I firmly refused to sign this ridiculous predatory agreement. Sarah smiled a genuine, triumphant, vicious smile. It was the exact expression of a predator closing a trap. She had clearly been waiting for me to ask that exact question. She told me that if I did not sign those papers tonight, Caroline was going straight to the courthouse tomorrow morning to launch a brutal, relentless custody battle. My blood ran completely cold, freezing in my veins. The corporate money did not matter to me. The stock equity and the expensive house were just material objects that could easily be replaced. But my 2 children were my entire universe. I had willingly sacrificed my entire professional life for them. I had spent thousands of hours sitting with them at our dining table, rigorously teaching them to read and speak perfect English, Italian, German, and Mandarin. I was the one who knew their deepest fears, their biggest dreams, and their daily routines. Caroline barely knew the names of their school teachers, and she constantly forgot their medical appointments. Sarah stepped even closer, her voice dropping into a low, theatrical, threatening whisper. She told me Caroline had already retained the best, most aggressive family lawyers in the entire state. She said they would absolutely destroy my character in open court. They would paint me as an unemployed, lazy, unmotivated failure who completely lacked the financial stability to provide a proper, safe home for 2 growing children. She cruelly reminded me that Caroline was now a wealthy, powerful corporate executive with virtually infinite legal resources. She said a judge would take one single look at my empty bank account, my lack of a recent resume, and hand full permanent custody over to the highly successful mother. Brent chimed in, laughing loudly and clapping his hands together. He said I would be incredibly lucky if a judge even let me see my own kids every other weekend at a supervised public park. He told me I had absolutely no leverage, no money, and no power in this situation. He said if I signed the agreement tonight, Caroline would generously allow me to keep my old reliable car, and she would agree to a basic standard joint custody arrangement. But if I decided to be stubborn and fight her, she would bury me under a massive mountain of legal fees until I was completely bankrupt, homeless, and totally alone. They were intentionally weaponizing my deep, unconditional love for my children. They were actively using the 2 pure, innocent lives I had carefully nurtured as leverage to completely steal my financial future. It was the most evil, highly calculating move I had ever witnessed in my entire life. They truly believed I was a weak, submissive, passive man who would just roll over and surrender because I was too terrified to fight back against true wealth and power. I stood perfectly still in the quiet grand lobby. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not show any outward anger, panic, or fear. I simply looked at the 2 toxic, superficial people standing in front of me. I thought about the deep, hidden irony of their aggressive threats. They were actively threatening me with total financial ruin. They were mocking my modest clothes and calling me a complete failure who had never accomplished anything. They had absolutely no idea that the brilliant global trade strategies Caroline was publicly taking credit for were actually conceived, researched, and written entirely by me. They had no idea that I possessed an elite intellectual foundation that could easily generate millions of dollars overnight if I chose to re-enter the consulting market. I looked squarely at Brent. I saw the cheap, fragile arrogance in his bloodshot eyes. I remembered the secret financial documents I had accidentally seen in his home office months ago, confirming that his commercial real estate business was failing terribly. I knew he was exactly 3 months behind on the massive second mortgage he had secretly taken out on his own house just to buy his wife a new luxury car. I looked at Sarah and her heavy, expensive diamond jewelry. I knew she was living a complete miserable lie, desperately trying to match her younger sister's newly stolen success by spending money they did not actually have. They were a fragile house of cards boldly threatening a solid concrete pillar. I slowly and deliberately closed the heavy manila folder. The sound of the thick, stiff paper snapping shut echoed sharply in the empty lobby, cutting through the silence. I handed the legal folder directly back to Brent. I did not shove it in anger. I handed it back to him with calm, steady, unwavering precision. I told him in a voice as cold as ice that I was not going to sign a single page of that predatory agreement. Brent looked completely shocked. He instinctively took the folder back, his face dropping in genuine, pure confusion. He clearly expected me to break down crying, begging for mercy, or scrambling for a pen in sheer panic. Sarah's triumphant, vicious smile instantly vanished from her face. Her eyes narrowed with sudden, furious, unhinged anger. She demanded to know if I was stupid, delusional, or just completely insane. She loudly repeated her threat, saying they would take my children away forever and leave me rotting in the street with nothing. I looked Sarah directly in the eyes, refusing to back down a single inch. I spoke with a quiet, cold, absolute certainty that made her physically step back, away from me. I told her that Caroline could hire every single expensive divorce lawyer in this entire city. I told her she could try her absolute best to take the house, the cars, and the corporate money. But I promised her, with absolute unwavering conviction, that nobody on this earth was ever going to take my children away from me. I told her that my kids know exactly who raised them, and they know exactly who put the hard daily work in every single day, while their mother was out chasing hollow, empty corporate titles. Brent stepped forward again, his face turning bright red with fresh, explosive anger. He raised his hand, pointing a thick, shaking finger directly at my face. He told me I was making the absolute biggest mistake of my miserable, pathetic life. He said I had no idea the kind of powerful people I was dealing with, and that Caroline was going to crush me like an insignificant insect under her expensive shoes. I did not flinch. I did not blink or move a single muscle in defense. I just stared at his pointing finger with absolute, calm authority, until he felt foolish enough to slowly, awkwardly lower his hand back to his side. The power dynamic in the grand lobby was rapidly, actively shifting, and they could both feel it in the air. They had walked out here expecting an easy, painless execution, but instead they had just accidentally awakened something incredibly dangerous and completely unshakable. I told them both to get out of my way immediately. I said this pathetic conversation was officially over and I was going to call my own attorney to handle this absolute garbage. I stepped forward, forcing Brent and Sarah to part ways and let me walk straight through them. They stood completely frozen in the lobby, watching me walk toward the glass front exit. I pulled my cell phone from my suit pocket. My hands were perfectly steady. I felt a massive surge of adrenaline perfectly mixed with cold surgical focus. The war had officially started. Caroline had fired the first brutal shots with her humiliating speech in the ballroom and this ruthless legal document in the lobby. She thought she had completely cornered me. She thought I was completely trapped with zero options and zero resources. I unlocked my phone screen to dial the secure number for my old corporate lawyer. But as the bright screen lit up, I saw a series of urgent red automated text messages waiting for me. The conflict was not pausing for even a single second. The next layer of Caroline's brutal, meticulously planned trap had already been triggered while I was standing right here in the lobby. The financial warfare had officially begun, and I was about to discover just how deeply she had severed my lifelines before I even knew we were fighting. The grand lobby of the country club was perfectly still as I swiped my thumb across the glowing screen of my mobile phone. I needed to call my corporate attorney immediately to block whatever aggressive legal maneuvering Sarah and Brent were attempting to execute. But the moment my home screen unlocked, a relentless cascade of bright red automated notifications flooded my display. They were not standard text messages from friends or ordinary emails from local businesses. They were urgent fraud alerts, emergency overdraft warnings, and critical security notices from every single financial institution we had ever used during our entire 8-year marriage. My heart hit my ribs with a heavy, painful thud as I opened the first primary banking application. The interface loaded agonizingly slowly against the exclusive country club wireless network. And when the numbers finally appeared on the bright screen, my blood turned to absolute ice. Our primary joint checking account, which held the substantial emergency liquid fund I had carefully managed for years, was completely empty. The bold black numbers read a staggering balance of 0. I tapped frantically into our shared savings account, where we securely kept the large funds dedicated to our 2 children and their future educational expenses. It was also completely drained, leaving nothing behind but digital dust. Every single penny had been systematically wired out to a private offshore holding account that I did not recognize and could not legally access. This was not a sudden emotional decision made in the heat of a marital argument. This was a highly calculated and meticulously executed financial ambush. I quickly opened my secondary banking application to aggressively check the status of my personal credit cards. The bright red text glared back at me through the screen, stating firmly that the accounts were permanently frozen due to a sudden drastic change in primary ownership status. Caroline had not just taken the available liquid cash. She had ruthlessly contacted the credit bureaus and the senior banking executives, claiming she was the sole financial provider and completely shutting down my ability to spend a single dime. I stood entirely alone in the middle of a luxury country club surrounded by towering marble pillars, expensive antique artwork, and imported crystal chandeliers, realizing that my entire financial existence had just been surgically eradicated. I opened my own small private checking account, the one I quietly kept for minor daily personal expenses like coffee and parking meters. The screen loaded to reveal a pathetic balance of exactly $42. That was my entire total net worth at this exact moment. $42 to my name, while my wife stood in the massive ballroom just a few hundred feet away, celebrating her massive corporate promotion and drinking champagne that cost 10 times more than everything I currently owned. The sheer unadulterated ruthlessness of her strategy was completely breathtaking. For the past 8 years, I had taught her everything she knew about aggressive corporate acquisitions. I had spent countless late nights sitting at our modest kitchen table, explaining exactly how to legally corner a powerful opponent and cut off their vital resources before they even realized they were actively in a fight. She had taken my brilliant foundational strategies and maliciously weaponized them directly against me. She knew with absolute certainty that if I had access to our shared funds, I would immediately hire the best aggressive litigation attorneys in the city to legally protect my rights and firmly secure full custody of our 2 children. So she completely neutralized the threat before she even fired the first public shot on that stage. She wanted me completely paralyzed and utterly desperate. She wanted me to wake up tomorrow morning with no money for a lawyer, no access to our beautiful home, and absolutely no ability to fight back against the massive, destructive legal machine she was about to unleash upon my life. She wanted me completely broken and subservient. A normal average man would have instantly collapsed under the crushing, suffocating weight of that terrifying realization. A weaker man would have dropped his phone on the polished marble floor and fallen to his knees in pure, unbridled panic, begging for mercy. But as I stared at the pathetic $42 balance glowing brightly on my screen, a strange and incredibly powerful calm washed over my entire physical body. The initial shock evaporated into the cool air and was instantly replaced by a cold, surgical clarity. I did not feel any fear. I felt a deep, profound sense of permanent liberation. For 8 incredibly long years, I had carried the heavy, exhausting burden of actively supporting a woman who constantly demanded more status, more money, and more superficial power. I had completely sacrificed my own massive professional potential just to keep her comfortable, secure, and happy. Now she had violently and permanently severed every single tie between us. She truly thought she was leaving me with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. She had absolutely no idea that by destroying our shared financial foundation, she had just set me completely free to boldly rebuild my own unshakable empire without her heavy, toxic anchor dragging me down into the dirt. Before I could confidently put my phone back into my suit pocket, the heavy, ornate oak doors of the ballroom swung open once again. This time it was not Sarah and Brent coming out to deliver cheap, petty insults. It was Caroline herself. She walked out into the grand, quiet lobby, moving with the slow, deliberate, arrogant grace of a powerful queen inspecting her newly conquered territory. The $3,000 silk designer dress flowed perfectly around her legs as she approached. But she was not walking out here alone. Flanking her closely on either side were 2 massive, intimidating men wearing dark, tailored suits and earpieces. They were the private, elite corporate security guards hired strictly by the country club to physically protect the wealthy VIP guests from any unwanted disturbances. Caroline had a serene, perfectly practiced, smug smile fixed securely on her face. It was the exact same fake warm smile she had just used on the bright stage to completely destroy my personal reputation in front of 200 wealthy corporate executives. She looked absolutely radiant and entirely victorious. She stopped gracefully about 10 feet away from me, letting the 2 large security guards step slightly forward to establish a firm physical barrier between us. She looked at me from head to toe with an expression of pure, toxic, condescending pity. She tilted her head slightly to the left and let out a soft, theatrical sigh that echoed quietly in the massive, empty lobby. She told me in a smooth, confident voice that it was a terrible, tragic shame that I could not just gracefully accept my proper, quiet place in the background of her incredible life. She said she had given me a perfectly good, comfortable existence, and all I had to do to keep it was stay quiet, remain completely invisible, and stay totally out of her way while she conquered the corporate world. Her voice was incredibly smooth and remarkably calm, completely devoid of any real human emotion or guilt. She was speaking to me the exact same cold way a ruthless corporate executive firmly speaks to an incompetent, low-level employee they are about to permanently terminate without severance. I did not say a single word in immediate response. I just stood there, looking directly at her perfectly manicured face, and seriously wondered how I had ever foolishly mistaken her ruthless, selfish ambition for actual, genuine love. Caroline crossed her arms tightly across her chest and took a small, confident step closer, knowing she was safely protected by the 2 looming, muscular guards standing ready at her sides. She proudly told me she had already been fully informed by her sister, Sarah, that I was acting stubbornly and aggressively, refusing to sign the very generous post-nuptial agreement they had drafted. She smiled a cold, vicious, unfeeling smile and told me my stubborn, pathetic refusal was completely pointless now, because the war was already entirely over before I even knew it had started. She proudly and loudly announced that she had already taken full legal control of all our financial assets, our properties, and our investments, and that my personal credit cards were now entirely useless pieces of plastic. She looked down at my simple, modest, dark suit with visible, utter disgust and told me I did not belong in a beautiful, expensive place like this anymore. She boldly stated that this country club was her exclusive corporate event, specifically celebrating her incredible, massive success, and my lingering presence was now officially classified as a dangerous security risk. Caroline turned her head slightly to the right and nodded sharply to the taller, broader security guard standing beside her. She looked confidently back at me and delivered her final, brutal, unforgiving ultimatum. She told me she was generously giving me exactly 2 short minutes to turn around and walk quietly out the front glass doors of the country club entirely under my own power. If I stubbornly refused to leave quietly like a good defeated boy, she would immediately instruct the security guards to physically drag me out onto the cold street in front of the valet staff and any wealthy guests who happened to be watching the spectacle. She said she would then immediately call the local police and file a permanent restraining order, claiming I was acting violently unstable and highly aggressive, ensuring with absolute certainty that I would never be legally allowed anywhere near our 2 children ever again. She was actively and maliciously weaponizing the legal system, the private country club security, and our own innocent kids, just to publicly and permanently establish her absolute unchecked dominance over my entire life. The taller security guard took a heavy, intimidating step directly toward me and firmly asked me to turn around and move immediately toward the front exit. His voice was deep rumbling and highly commanding, the unmistakable voice of a man who was very used to getting exactly what he wanted through the sheer threat of physical intimidation. I looked directly into the aggressive guard's eyes, and I did not move a single fraction of an inch. I planted my feet firmly and squarely on the polished marble floor, and I straightened my shoulders to my absolute full height. I was not a naturally violent man, but I was absolutely not going to be intimidated or bullied by rented temporary muscle hired by a toxic woman who built her entire towering career entirely on my stolen secret intelligence. I slowly shifted my intense, unblinking gaze back to Caroline. Her cold, arrogant, confident smile actually faltered and twitched for just a tiny fraction of a second, when she suddenly realized I was not completely crumbling in fear and begging for mercy. She fully expected me to fall down crying and beg for my credit cards back, or desperately plead with her to let me stay in our house for just a few more days. She fully expected to see a pathetic, defeated, completely broken failure. Instead, I spoke to her with a voice so incredibly calm, so deeply quiet, and so absolutely terrifyingly steady that she actually had to strain her neck slightly forward just to hear my words over the distant, muffled classical music still coming from the party in the ballroom. I told her, looking straight through her fake persona, that she was making a truly catastrophic, massive mathematical error. I calmly explained that quietly stealing the joint checking accounts, draining the savings, and locking the credit cards was a very standard, very basic, low-level corporate aggressive maneuver. I told her it was exactly the kind of highly predictable, cheap amateur strategy I would entirely expect from someone who desperately memorized my brilliant late-night notes, but never actually understood the deep, fundamental, complex mechanics of true international power. The fake radiant color drained instantly and noticeably from her cheeks. She absolutely hated being explicitly reminded that I was the true hidden source of her entire intellectual foundation. She quickly tried to recover her shattered composure and let out a sharp, mean, shaky laugh, aggressively telling me my arrogant words meant absolutely nothing in the real world when my bank account was completely, totally empty. I took one slow, highly deliberate, and incredibly confident step directly toward her, instantly causing both massive security guards to immediately tense their muscles and aggressively reach out for my arms. I raised my right hand in a quick, sharp, commanding gesture of absolute authority that somehow made them both instantly stop dead in their tracks, completely unsure of what to do next. It was the absolute, unshakable, radiating confidence of a man who truly knows his own immense, irreplaceable value. I looked Caroline directly and deeply in the eyes, and I told her that money sitting in a shared bank account is just temporary, easily movable liquid capital. It can be quickly moved, easily hidden, or cheaply stolen by weak, pathetic people who desperately need to feel powerful to hide their own massive insecurities. But true wealth, true, permanent, unshakable, absolute power is the actual internal ability to generate that massive capital completely out of thin air, using nothing but your own mind. I told her she had cleverly stolen the golden eggs, but she had just completely, permanently alienated the only actual goose that ever knew how to lay them. Caroline narrowed her eyes tightly, her face flushing a deep, bright red with sudden, explosive, hot anger. She absolutely despised it when I spoke to her with quiet, calm, undeniable authority. It shattered her entire, carefully constructed illusion of superiority. She sharply ordered the security guards to grab me by force and throw me out the front glass doors into the cold night immediately. The two massive men stepped aggressively forward, reaching their thick, heavy hands out to forcefully grab my shoulders and physically remove me from the premises. The heavy tension in the grand, silent lobby reached an absolute explosive boiling point. I braced my legs firmly, ready to physically and aggressively resist if they actually dared to put their hands on me. I was completely preparing for a brutal, ugly, highly public physical altercation that would most likely end with police sirens, flashing lights, and total chaos in the country club parking lot. Caroline took a quick step backward, crossing her arms tightly and smiling a triumphant, vicious smile, completely ready and eager to watch my final, ultimate physical humiliation violently unfold right in front of her eyes. The heavy tension in the grand, silent lobby reached an absolute explosive boiling point. I braced my legs firmly against the polished marble floor, preparing for the brutal, physical impact. The two massive security guards took a synchronized step forward, their thick hands reaching out to grab my shoulders and forcefully eject me from the building. I could see the muscles tightening under their dark, tailored suits. I could hear the heavy thud of their expensive shoes against the stone. I was entirely ready to fight back. I had absolutely nothing left to lose. My bank accounts were completely drained. My credit cards were entirely frozen. My total net worth was sitting at exactly $42. The only thing I had left in the entire world was my unshakable pride, and I was absolutely not going to let rented country club muscle drag me out into the cold night like a discarded piece of trash. Caroline stood safely behind the two towering men, crossing her arms tightly over her $3,000 designer gown. Her face was twisted into a triumphant, vicious smile. She was actively savoring every single second of my impending physical humiliation. She wanted to see me struggle. She wanted to watch me get violently pushed through the front glass doors in front of the valet staff. She desperately needed to permanently establish her absolute, unchecked dominance over my life so she could return to her lavish party feeling like an untouchable corporate queen. She opened her mouth to deliver one final cruel insult, to order the guards to twist my arms behind my back and throw me onto the pavement. But she never got the chance to speak a single word. Before the security guards could even lay a single finger on my suit jacket, a massive, sudden noise violently shattered the tense silence of the lobby. The towering, heavy oak front doors of the country club were thrown completely open with incredible force. The heavy brass handles slammed loudly against the interior walls, echoing like a gunshot through the cavernous space. A rush of freezing cold night air swept instantly across the lobby, carrying the faint smell of city rain and expensive car exhaust. The two security guards immediately stopped dead in their tracks. Their hands froze just inches away from my shoulders. Their professional instincts instantly kicked in, causing them to spin around and face the sudden, unexpected disruption at the main entrance. Caroline aggressively uncrossed her arms, her victorious smile instantly vanishing. She snapped her head toward the front doors, clearly furious that someone had dared to interrupt her perfect moment of absolute victory. Standing in the center of the open doorway was Richard Sterling. He was the legendary billionaire chief executive officer of the massive global firm where Caroline worked. He was a man who commanded absolute authority without ever needing to raise his voice. He was in his late 60s with silver hair neatly combed back and eyes that were as cold and sharp as chipped gray stone. He wore a heavy dark wool overcoat draped perfectly over a flawless charcoal business suit. He did not look like a man arriving late to a joyful corporate celebration. He looked like a ruthless military general stepping onto a chaotic battlefield to personally execute a failing commander. Richard Sterling was a terrifying figure in the international financial world. He had built his massive global empire completely from the ground up entirely through sheer, ruthless competence and an absolute refusal to tolerate incompetence or fraud. He was notoriously private and rarely ever attended these superficial networking events. His sudden, unannounced physical presence in the country club lobby was the corporate equivalent of a massive, unexpected earthquake. The transformation that instantly overtook Caroline was truly sickening to witness. The vicious, calculating predator who had just proudly orchestrated my total financial ruin completely vanished in a fraction of a second. She was instantly replaced by a desperate, sycophantic corporate climber. Her entire physical posture changed immediately. She dropped her aggressive stance and quickly smoothed down the front of her expensive silk dress. She aggressively waved her hands at the two security guards, silently ordering them to immediately step away from me and hide themselves in the shadows. She desperately did not want the legendary CEO to see her engaged in a trashy public domestic dispute in the middle of a luxury lobby. Caroline quickly turned her head and shot a frantic, desperate look at her sister Sarah and her brother-in-law Brent. They were still standing near the hallway, completely frozen in shock. Caroline frantically signaled for them to stand up straight and look respectable. Sarah quickly adjusted her heavy diamond necklace, her eyes wide with sudden panic. Brent hastily buttoned his tight suit jacket, trying desperately to look like a successful, wealthy man instead of a failing real estate agent drowning in hidden debt. They all wanted to bask in the warm, glowing light of true absolute power. Caroline took a deep breath and pasted a bright, warm, incredibly fake smile across her face. She completely turned her back on me, dismissing my entire existence as if I was nothing more than a temporary smudge on the marble floor. She began walking gracefully toward the front doors, her expensive heels clicking rhythmically against the stone. She was moving with deliberate, manufactured elegance, projecting the perfect image of a highly successful, newly promoted vice president ready to welcome her ultimate boss. Richard Sterling stepped fully into the lobby, letting the heavy oak doors swing shut behind him. He did not look at the expensive antique paintings on the walls. He did not look at the massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. His cold gray eyes scanned the large room for exactly 1 second before locking onto a specific target. Caroline confidently closed the distance between them. She projected her voice so it would echo beautifully across the quiet lobby, perfectly modulating her tone to sound incredibly professional and deeply honored. "Mr. Sterling, what an absolutely incredible, unexpected honor to see you tonight," she said, her voice dripping with thick, manufactured sweetness. "We were just wrapping up the formal dinner portion of the evening. The entire board of directors will be absolutely thrilled that you decided to make an appearance to celebrate the new European acquisitions team." She stopped exactly 3 feet in front of him and gracefully extended her right hand. It was the perfectly practiced, firm, corporate handshake she had rehearsed 1,000 times. The expensive diamond wedding ring on her finger, the exact same ring I had purchased by working endless overtime hours years ago, caught the bright light of the lobby. She stood there, smiling, radiating fake confidence, fully expecting the legendary billionaire to take her hand, warmly congratulate her on her massive promotion, and officially welcome her into his elite inner circle of power. Richard Sterling did not slow his walking pace by a single fraction of a second. He did not raise his hand to meet hers. He did not offer a polite nod of greeting. He did not even blink. He looked at Caroline with the exact same blank, unfeeling expression a person uses when they step around a piece of broken furniture left abandoned on a city sidewalk. It was not a look of anger or disgust. It was a look of total, absolute dismissal. He treated her as if she simply did not physically exist in the real world. Caroline stood completely frozen, her arm extended rigidly into the empty air. Her bright fake smile instantly cracked and shattered into a dozen pieces. Her eyes widened in pure, genuine shock as the reality of the brutal public snub registered in her brain. Sterling kept walking. He physically bypassed her entirely, stepping smoothly around her frozen body without brushing against her dress. He completely ignored her desperate, sycophantic greeting. He completely ignored Sarah and Brent, who had stepped forward, hoping for an introduction. He walked straight through the center of her fake, shallow world, completely destroying her manufactured illusion of power, with nothing more than his absolute silence. The 2 massive security guards, who had been aggressively preparing to throw me out just moments ago, immediately recognized the shift in the atmosphere. They were trained to read body language, and they instantly realized that the man in the dark overcoat possessed more actual power in his left shoe than Caroline would ever possess in her entire lifetime. The guards nervously stepped backward, retreating completely into the shadows and lowering their heads in deep submission. Caroline slowly, awkwardly lowered her hand back to her side. The dark red flush of deep, absolute embarrassment crawled rapidly up her neck and completely covered her face. She spun around her silk dress, twisting around her legs, desperate to see exactly where the billionaire CEO was going. She desperately hoped he was just heading toward the ballroom doors or the coat check desk. She desperately prayed that she had just somehow misread the situation. But Richard Sterling was not heading toward the ballroom. He was walking directly, purposefully toward the dark shadows at the back of the lobby. He was walking exactly toward the spot where I was currently standing. The sound of his heavy leather shoes striking the marble floor echoed sharply in the massive room. Every single step he took felt like a hammer striking a loud, heavy bell. He crossed the final few feet of the lobby and came to a complete sudden stop squarely in front of me. We stood face to face. The contrast between us was visually extreme. He was a legendary billionaire titan of industry wearing a flawless custom overcoat. I was an unemployed, deliberately impoverished father wearing a cheap 5-year-old dark suit with exactly $42 remaining in my checking account. But as I looked directly into his cold, sharp gray eyes, I did not feel small. I did not feel intimidated or frightened. I felt the exact same steady, heavy, unshakable calm that I saw reflecting back at me in his own gaze. We recognized each other instantly. We were two men who operated entirely on cold, hard facts and brutal strategy, while everyone else in the building was busy playing expensive, childish games of dress-up. The entire grand lobby fell completely terrifyingly dead silent. The faint muffled sound of the classical string quartet playing in the distant ballroom completely faded away. The aggressive, heavy breathing of the security guards stopped entirely. Sarah and Brent stood completely frozen by the hallway, their mouths hanging slightly open in pure, stunned disbelief. Caroline was standing a few feet away, looking absolutely horrified. Her mind desperately, frantically trying to comprehend why the most powerful man in her entire universe had just deliberately walked past her to stand directly in front of the husband she had just publicly declared a total, pathetic, worthless failure. Sterling did not look back at Caroline. He did not acknowledge the security guards. He kept his sharp, intelligent eyes locked squarely and intensely on my face. He took a slow, deep breath, adjusting the heavy lapels of his dark overcoat. The absolute heavy tension in the air was so incredibly thick it felt like it could shatter the antique windows. The cheap, fake corporate war Caroline had tried to violently start was officially over. The true heavy artillery had just arrived on the battlefield, and she had absolutely no idea that all the massive guns were currently pointing directly at her fragile glass castle. The grand lobby of the country club was completely paralyzed by the sudden arrival of Richard Sterling. The heavy oak doors had firmly shut behind him, blocking out the bright lights and the loud cheering from the ballroom, but the sheer force of his presence had entirely, completely rewritten the atmosphere in the room. I stood perfectly still on the cold, polished marble floor, watching the legendary billionaire deliberately ignore my wife to stand squarely in front of me. The silence stretching between us was so absolute that I could hear the faint rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing in the distant hallway. Caroline was completely frozen just a few feet away with her outstretched, welcoming hand suspended awkwardly in the empty air. A dark, terrible flush of complete humiliation was rapidly crawling up her neck and spreading across her face. She was staring at her ultimate boss with wide, panicked eyes, utterly incapable of processing why the most powerful man in her entire corporate universe had just intentionally bypassed her glorious moment of victory to acknowledge the husband she had just publicly declared a worthless failure. Sterling did not break his intense eye contact with me for even a single fraction of a second. His cold, sharp gray eyes evaluated me with the exact same calculating precision he used to dismantle rival corporations. He reached inside his heavy, dark, custom wool overcoat and slowly pulled out a massive, thick, leather-bound dossier. The dark leather was visibly worn at the corners and heavily creased, suggesting it was a physical file of immense high-stakes importance that he had been carrying personally for days. He took one slow, deliberate step to his right and dropped the massive dossier onto a nearby ornate marble table. The heavy, solid thud of the thick leather hitting the cold stone echoed sharply like a gunshot through the quiet lobby. The sudden, sharp noise made Sarah and Brent physically flinch in the background, taking another quick step backward into the dark shadows. Sterling did not even bother to look in their pathetic direction. He kept his unwavering focus entirely on me. He took a slow, deep breath, adjusting the lapels of his immaculate suit, and began to speak. His voice was not loud, but it carried a deep, undeniable, heavy authority that instantly commanded the entire massive space. He bypassed all standard corporate pleasantries and introductory small talk, getting straight to the brutal heart of the matter. He told me with surgical precision that his global firm was currently bleeding heavily on the international stage. He revealed a massive, urgent corporate crisis, stating that a $500 million international merger was rapidly and violently collapsing. This was not a standard basic domestic acquisition that could be handled by low-level managers or flashy executives who relied on charm to close small deals. He explained with absolute cold clarity that they were desperately attempting to finalize a highly volatile, unprecedented merger with a notoriously difficult Asian and European conglomerate. This specific overseas syndicate was universally feared in the global financial world for employing ruthless, aggressive negotiation tactics and intentionally burying predatory legal loopholes deep within endless mountains of complex foreign paperwork. Sterling stated that his entire elite executive team, including the newly promoted vice presidents sitting blindly in the lavish ballroom next door, were completely paralyzed by the sheer aggressive complexity of the opposing legal strategy. He unclasped the heavy brass lock on the leather flap of the dossier and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of crisp legal documents. He spread the dense, bright white pages forcefully across the polished, dark marble table right in front of us. He pointed a firm, steady finger at the complex text and revealed the absolute core of the terrifying corporate problem. The opposing international conglomerate had deliberately drafted the final binding contracts entirely in complex Mandarin and highly technical legal German. They had intentionally woven intricate, strict European regulatory loopholes perfectly together with aggressive Asian financial clauses, creating a massive legal labyrinth designed specifically to trap Sterling and bleed his company dry over the next decade. He stated that his highly paid legal team had spent the last 72 grueling hours desperately running the texts through expensive translation software and consulting panicked foreign advisors, but they were still totally blind to the actual strategic financial traps hidden deeply within the native phrasing. As I looked down at the documents, my mind instantly recognized the precise characters and the complex grammar structures. These were the exact same languages I had spent thousands of hours rigorously teaching my children at our modest kitchen table. I knew the subtle aggressive nuances of the Mandarin trade clauses, and I could clearly see the strict rigid conditions buried in the German legal syntax. While Carolyn had been out drinking expensive champagne and claiming credit for my work, I had been keeping my mind perfectly sharp, preparing for a moment exactly like this. The heavy silence was suddenly broken by a desperate, frantic sound. Caroline finally found her shaking voice. She stepped aggressively forward, desperately trying to salvage her completely shattered illusion of control and regain the attention of the billionaire. She pasted a frantic, terrified fake smile onto her face and aggressively tried to insert herself back into the power dynamic of the room. She told Sterling in a high-pitched, nervous, desperate voice that he did not need to worry about those difficult documents on a night meant for celebration. She boldly and foolishly claimed that if he simply handed the massive files over to her, she would immediately assemble her new elite acquisitions team, and they would work tirelessly through the entire weekend to completely decipher the contracts. She was aggressively trying to play the familiar role of the dedicated, brilliant vice president one last time, hoping the sheer force of her fake confidence would somehow save her rapidly sinking ship. She actually reached her manicured hand out toward the marble table, attempting to take possession of the highly confidential documents. Sterling slowly turned his head and finally looked directly at Caroline. The look he gave her was so incredibly cold and entirely empty of any basic human respect that it physically stopped her hand in midair and forced her to take a trembling step backward. He did not yell at her in explosive anger. He did not raise his deep voice a single decibel. He simply dismantled her entire fake corporate empire with absolute surgical precision right there in the open lobby. He told her in a low, steady, terrifying voice that he knew exactly what she actually was. He revealed the devastating massive twist to everyone standing frozen in the room. He told her, looking straight through her expensive designer facade and her $3,000 dress, that he knew with absolute concrete certainty that she did not write the brilliant acquisition strategies that had successfully gotten her promoted. Caroline gasped audibly, her manicured hands flying up rapidly to cover her mouth in pure, genuine horror. The heavy, expensive diamond earrings she wore suddenly looked incredibly cheap and entirely foolish against her pale, terrified face. Sarah and Brent, who had been aggressively threatening me with total financial ruin just moments ago, stepped quickly back even further into the dark hallway. Their previous arrogant sneers were completely wiped away and entirely replaced by pure, unadulterated fear. The toxic sister and brother-in-law suddenly realized they were standing far too close to the blast radius of a massive permanent corporate execution, and they wanted absolutely nothing to do with it anymore. Sterling completely ignored her dramatic gasp and turned his full, unwavering attention back to me, continuing his methodical, ruthless exposure of her endless lies. He explained to the quiet lobby that when he first read the incredibly complex global market analysis she had submitted to the aggressive board of directors last quarter, he was genuinely deeply impressed by the towering intellect on the pages. But the brilliant strategic patient mind clearly reflected in those complex documents simply did not match the shallow, highly aggressive, superficial corporate climbing persona she consistently displayed in the office. He knew a woman who spent half her day obsessing over networking galas and office politics could never possess the deep, calm architectural vision required to structure such a masterpiece of international trade. So the legendary CEO initiated a quiet, ruthless private security investigation into her daily workflow to find the actual truth. Sterling revealed the absolute undeniable proof that permanently destroyed her career. He had ordered his elite corporate security team to deeply track the digital internet protocol addresses and the hidden encrypted metadata of every single major document she had ever submitted to the executive board. He told the absolutely silent room that the concrete digital metadata proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the massive complex files were consistently generated, researched, and heavily edited in the middle of the night from a specific residential internet network. He coldly pointed out the massive, glaring timestamp discrepancies, noting that the most brilliant visionary paragraphs of her entire career were being actively typed and saved at the exact same moment Caroline was physically swiping her corporate security badge and drinking expensive wine at downtown networking events. His investigators tracked the unique linguistic patterns, the deeply complex economic structuring, and the flawless, masterful integration of highly obscure foreign market trends right back to our home IP address. He looked directly and deeply into my eyes and stated that he knew without a single lingering doubt that I was the actual hidden ghostwriter all along. He knew I was the invisible force who had stayed awake until 3 a.m, fueled by black coffee and sheer quiet dedication, untangling the massive global tariffs she could never even begin to comprehend. He revealed that his private investigators had easily uncovered my past, looking into the highly successful boutique international consulting firm I had quietly liquidated 8 years ago to fund her Ivy League tuition in cash. He recognized the unmistakable, brilliant signature of my specific strategic mind, perfectly woven into every single successful high-stakes proposal Caroline had ever falsely claimed as her own original work. The heavy, crushing weight of the absolute, undeniable truth completely suffocated Caroline where she stood. Her heavily leveraged, luxurious lifestyle, her fake, unearned promotions, her designer clothes, and the vicious, predatory post-nuptial agreement she had just tried to forcefully serve me to steal my children were all instantly, completely worthless. The grand, towering illusion she had spent 8 long years building by ruthlessly standing on my quiet shoulders was violently, permanently shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces in a matter of seconds. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some kind of desperate, pathetic excuse or lie, but absolutely no words came out. She was entirely exposed as a total fraud in front of the one man who controlled her entire financial existence. The billionaire CEO looked at me with deep, genuine professional respect, seeing right past my cheap, faded 5-year-old suit and recognizing the massive, immense intellectual value I actually possessed. He knew I was the only person in the entire city capable of reading the complex Mandarin and German documents sitting on the marble table. He knew I was the only man who could see the hidden financial traps and successfully navigate the $500 million merger that was actively threatening his global empire. He leaned slightly forward, placing his large, strong hands firmly on the cold marble table right next to the dense contracts. He delivered the final, absolute, devastating blow to Caroline's fragile glass castle, completely erasing her from the equation. He looked directly at me, his gray eyes burning with cold, serious, absolute intent, and said he did not need a middleman anymore because he needed the architect. The heavy silence in the grand lobby felt entirely different now. Just moments ago, it was the heavy, suffocating silence of my impending destruction. Now it was the sharp, electric silence of absolute awe. Richard Sterling stood motionless, waiting for my response. He had just deliberately bypassed his entire executive team, completely dismantled my wife's fraudulent career, and handed the fate of a $500 million international merger directly to me. I did not rush to answer him. For 8 long years I had conditioned myself to remain quietly in the background, to intentionally shrink my presence so Caroline could shine brightly under the corporate spotlight. I had swallowed my pride, buried my own fierce ambition, and allowed toxic, superficial people to treat me like a useless peasant. That painful era of my life ended right here on this cold, polished marble floor. I took a slow, deep breath and felt a profound, fundamental shift in my own physical posture. The heavy, invisible chains of my marriage dissolved completely. I squared my shoulders, standing to my absolute full height, and stepped confidently forward into the bright light. I walked directly past Caroline, who was still completely frozen in a state of pure, terrified shock. She looked like a fragile, hollow porcelain doll that had just been violently dropped onto concrete. I did not look at her. I did not spare a single glance for Sarah or Brent, who were currently hiding like cowards in the dark shadows of the hallway. I walked straight to the ornate table where the massive stack of foreign legal documents lay open. The bright, crisp white pages were densely packed with sharp black text. Half of the heavy documents were drafted in highly complex Mandarin characters, and the other half were written in dense, unforgiving legal German. To anyone else in the building, including every single powerful executive currently drinking champagne in the ballroom next door, these pages were an impenetrable, terrifying fortress of confusion. To me, they were a perfectly clear, transparent map. I placed my hands flat on the edge of the cold stone table and leaned over the documents. My eyes began to scan the Mandarin sections rapidly. These characters were not just basic conversational phrases or standard business greetings. They were intricate, highly specialized economic terms detailing sovereign wealth regulations, asset valuation metrics, and international tariff structures. I absorbed the dense information instantly. My mind shifted seamlessly into the rigorous, highly analytical gear I had aggressively honed over a decade of running my own boutique consulting firm. I traced the specific clauses regarding the transfer of physical overseas assets. The opposing Asian-European conglomerate was demanding immediate massive liquid capital injections based on highly volatile future market projections. It was an incredibly aggressive stance, but it was relatively standard for a deal of this magnitude. I did not stop there. I immediately cross-referenced those specific financial demands with the dense German regulatory documents lying right next to them on the marble table. This was exactly where the true brilliant malice of their trap was hidden. I read quickly through the rigid German syntax, flawlessly translating the complex legal vocabulary in my head. The European side of the massive conglomerate had quietly and maliciously inserted a massive compliance stipulation deeply buried under 3 separate layers of environmental liability subclauses. It was beautifully ruthless and incredibly dangerous. If Sterling signed this merger tonight, he would not just be acquiring their lucrative global distribution networks and their massive supply chains. He would be legally assuming full binding financial responsibility for decades of toxic debt and catastrophic environmental cleanup costs associated with a series of failing industrial factories located in Eastern Europe. The Mandarin valuation metrics were deliberately and carefully designed to artificially inflate the company worth on paper, while the German legal text quietly transferred a catastrophic financial time bomb directly onto Sterling's corporate balance sheet. They were actively using the massive, intimidating language barrier to completely blindfold the American executives while they casually robbed the vault. I stood up slowly, pulling my eyes away from the documents, and looked directly at Richard Sterling. The billionaire chief executive officer was watching me with intense, unblinking, predatory focus. He was a man who had survived and conquered a cutthroat global industry by perfectly reading people, and he was currently reading every single micro-expression on my face. He saw my eyes narrow. He saw the slight shift in my jaw. He knew with absolute certainty that I had found something incredibly important. I kept my voice perfectly calm and entirely devoid of any panic or emotion. I looked him straight in the eyes, and I told him he was walking straight into an absolute slaughter. I pointed a steady, confident finger at the 3rd page of the German contract resting on the table, and I explained exactly what the opposing conglomerate was aggressively attempting to do. I systematically broke down the complex toxic liability clause, translating it flawlessly into plain, brutal American English. I explained how the hidden environmental debt would easily eclipse the projected profits of the entire merger within the first 18 months of operation. I detailed the specific legal mechanics of how the European regulators would instantly seize his domestic assets the moment the ink dried on the signature page. I then pointed to the Mandarin text and revealed how the overseas negotiators had mathematically camouflaged the failing industrial assets to look like highly stable, high-yield investments. I told him this was not a mutually beneficial merger at all. It was a highly calculated hostile offloading of massive toxic debt wrapped securely in a beautiful, expensive ribbon. Sterling listened to my entire detailed analysis without interrupting me once. His sharp gray eyes narrowed slightly as he fully absorbed the devastating reality of the hidden trap. He did not question my translation. He did not ask for a second opinion from his legal team. He recognized the undeniable ringing sound of absolute truth and masterful competence in my voice. The heavy tension in his jaw tightened significantly as he realized just how incredibly close his massive firm had come to total financial disaster. His highly paid elite legal team had completely missed this catastrophic loophole. His aggressive, newly promoted vice president, standing just a few feet away from us, was completely and utterly clueless. If he had blindly trusted Caroline and her acquisitions team with this specific deal, his entire global empire would have suffered a catastrophic, fatal blow that could have easily bankrupted the firm. I let the heavy reality of the situation settle over the room for a few seconds. I was fully aware of the incredible leverage I now held in my hands. Just 30 minutes ago, I was sitting in the dark shadows of a ballroom listening to my wife publicly declare me a complete, worthless failure. Just 10 minutes ago, I was staring at a pathetic $42 balance on my frozen banking application, while country club security guards prepared to violently throw me out into the cold street. Now, the most powerful billionaire in the city was standing silently in front of me, hanging on to my every single word, because his entire corporate legacy depended entirely on my specific intellect. The absolute sheer irony of the situation was almost overwhelming, but I pushed all personal emotion aside. This was no longer a petty domestic dispute. This was a high-stakes global boardroom negotiation, and I was completely in my element. Sterling took a deep, slow breath and nodded his head slightly. He looked down at the massive stack of documents and then looked right back at me. He told me the opposing overseas conglomerate was currently holding the line hard, demanding a final signature by midnight tonight, or they would completely walk away from the negotiation table forever. They were aggressively using extreme time pressure to force a blind panic decision from the American executives. Sterling asked me directly if the entire deal was completely unsalvageable, or if there was a strategic way to counter their aggressive maneuver and turn the dangerous trap around. This was the exact pivotal moment the entire power dynamic of the universe flipped completely and permanently into my hands. I did not act like a desperate, broken man going through a hostile divorce. I acted like the absolute most valuable asset in the entire room, because at this exact moment, I absolutely was. I told Sterling with cold, unwavering confidence that the deal was entirely salvageable. I explained that the opposing conglomerate was deliberately overplaying their hand because they were secretly desperately reliant on securing American capital to save their own failing infrastructure. I told him their aggressive midnight deadline was a complete weak bluff. I said I could easily draft a massive counterproposal in perfect native Mandarin and highly aggressive legal German that would completely surgically neutralize their toxic liability clauses, while simultaneously forcing them to surrender a much larger permanent percentage of their highly lucrative distribution networks. I told him I could easily turn their own ruthless legal labyrinth directly against them and secure a massively profitable, unprecedented victory for his firm. But then I stopped talking. I crossed my arms smoothly and confidently over my chest and let a heavy, deliberate silence fall completely over the grand lobby. I looked the billionaire chief executive officer straight in the eyes, and I prepared to set my absolute unshakable terms. I told him I would not do this as a personal favor. I told him I would not do this just to save his massive company or to magically clean up the catastrophic mess his completely incompetent executives had blindly created. I told him I would only secure this massive global merger under my own extremely strict conditions. I explicitly stated that I would absolutely not sign a standard employment contract. I would not become another disposable face in his massive corporate machine, taking orders from people who possessed half my intellect. I demanded to operate exclusively as a highly independent contractor, operating completely under my own newly formed private consulting firm. I told him I would own my own time, my own strategies, and my own total independence. Sterling did not flinch or look away. He deeply respected raw, unbridled ambition, and he fully understood the cold, hard mechanics of absolute leverage. He knew I had him completely backed into a corner, and he respected the fact that I was actively capitalizing on it. He tilted his head slightly and asked me in a quiet, serious voice what my exact price was to save his empire tonight. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I demanded an immediate, massive, multi-million-dollar upfront retainer to be wired directly and instantly into a secure, independent corporate account before I even picked up a pen to draft the counterproposal. I told him that money was strictly for my time and my immediate availability. Furthermore, I demanded a permanent, legally binding percentage of the total financial yield of the entire merger once it was successfully finalized and signed. I was not asking for a generous executive salary or a nice, comfortable yearly bonus. I was forcefully demanding a massive, undeniable permanent piece of the actual global empire I was about to save. The numbers I was demanding were absolutely astronomical, completely dwarfing anything Caroline could ever hope to earn in her entire lifetime. I stood perfectly still, maintaining intense eye contact with Sterling, waiting for his response. I knew the immense value of the disaster I was preventing, and I knew the exact staggering worth of the massive profits I was about to secure. I was holding the absolute foundation of his entire global company in my hands, and we both fully understood that I was the only man on Earth who could successfully carry the weight. The echo of my multi-million-dollar demand hung heavy and absolute in the freezing air of the Grand Country Club lobby. Richard Sterling did not blink or flinch at the astronomical numbers I had just firmly laid on the table. But the sheer staggering magnitude of my absolute confidence finally shattered the state of terrified paralysis that had gripped my wife. Caroline suddenly realized that her entire carefully constructed universe was rapidly, violently slipping through her manicured fingers. The towering corporate illusion she had spent 8 long years building by quietly stealing my intellectual labor was actively burning to the ground right in front of her eyes. Panic, a deep, primal, unadulterated panic, completely overrode her shock. She lunged frantically forward, physically inserting herself between me and the legendary billionaire chief executive officer. Her $3,000 designer silk dress rustled sharply against the polished marble floor as she raised her hands in a desperate, frantic gesture of forced control. She plastered a terrifyingly wide, deeply unnatural smile onto her pale face. It was the exact same sycophantic hollow smile she used to charm foolish, aggressive board members. But tonight it looked like a fragile porcelain mask actively cracking under immense pressure. She spoke rapidly, her voice pitching a full octave higher than normal, as she desperately attempted to aggressively reclaim the narrative and assert her dominance. She let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh and told Sterling that this was all just a minor, unfortunate domestic misunderstanding. She boldly and foolishly claimed that he did not need to negotiate independent contracts or pay ridiculous multi-million-dollar retainers because she could easily manage her own husband. She aggressively reached out and tried to place a condescending hand on my shoulder, treating me like a disobedient child throwing a tantrum in public. She told the billionaire that I was simply her secret weapon, her quiet little helper who occasionally proofread her brilliant strategies. She casually acted as though keeping my towering global intellect locked secretly in our residential basement was a highly calculated, brilliant leadership strategy she had orchestrated all along. She promised Sterling that she would personally oversee the entire massive European-Asian negotiation process and ensure that I did exactly what I was told to save the firm. Richard Sterling looked down at her waving frantic hands with an expression of profound glacial disgust. He did not take a single step backward to give her space. He simply allowed his massive, intimidating physical presence to completely overshadow her desperate, frantic energy. The temperature in the grand lobby seemed to instantly plummet. The faint, cheerful, classical music drifting from the lavish ballroom next door felt a million miles away, completely disconnected from the brutal corporate execution about to take place. Sarah and Brent, who had crept slightly closer just moments ago, hoping to eagerly witness my total financial destruction, now stood completely frozen against the decorative marble pillars. The toxic sister and the failing real estate agent suddenly realized with pure terrifying clarity that they were about to watch the permanent absolute destruction of their only connection to true wealth and power. Sterling spoke, and his deep rumbling voice cut through her frantic, pathetic babbling like a heavy, sharpened steel blade. He firmly commanded her to lower her hands and close her mouth immediately. The sheer, blunt, undeniable force of his absolute authority made Caroline snap her jaw shut so quickly her teeth audibly clicked in the quiet room. He did not need to raise his voice or yell in anger because the heavy, absolute certainty vibrating in his chest forced total, instant submission from every single person breathing the air in that lobby. He looked at her expensive, tailored gown, her heavy diamond earrings, and her perfectly styled hair. He told her with cold, surgical precision that she was nothing more than a hollow, expensive parasite actively draining the lifeblood of his massive company. He methodically began to permanently dismantle her entire professional existence, right in front of her family and the few country club security guards who were lingering silently in the dark shadows. He pointed a steady, firm finger at the massive stack of complex Mandarin and German contracts resting openly on the cold stone table. He challenged her directly, staring straight through her fragile, false confidence. He ordered her to step up to the table and read just one single paragraph of the dense Asian financial valuation clauses. He demanded that she translate just one single line of the strict, unforgiving European regulatory stipulations that were currently threatening to completely bankrupt his entire global empire. Caroline stammered helplessly, her face burning a deep, humiliated scarlet red. Her eyes darted frantically across the crisp, white pages filled with complex foreign characters and rigid legal syntax. She could not read a single word. While I had spent thousands of rigorous hours sitting at our modest kitchen table patiently teaching our two children the complex tones of Mandarin because I knew it was the absolute strategic language of the future, she had spent her evenings drinking expensive wine and gossiping about office politics. While I had rigorously ensured our kids could read and speak perfect German to understand complex European history, she had spent her time aggressively shopping for luxury cars she could barely afford. She tried to deflect the devastating humiliation, claiming in a weak, shaking voice that senior executive vice presidents do not need to read the tedious legal fine print when they possess grand visionary leadership skills. Sterling let out a short, bitter laugh that held absolutely zero humor or warmth. He told her that true visionary global leadership requires a massive, unshakable foundation of absolute competence and deep linguistic intelligence. He completely stripped away her fancy corporate titles, telling her that she lacked basic strategic vision, basic technical capability, and basic human integrity. He stated firmly that she was a masterful manipulator, highly skilled at stealing credit from a brilliant man, but entirely useless when faced with a genuine, terrifying international financial crisis. I stood perfectly still and watched her physically shrink under the massive, crushing weight of his absolute, undeniable truth. For 8 incredibly long years I had quietly absorbed her petty insults and willingly swallowed my own massive pride, strictly to keep our family unit intact. I had silently listened to her brag loudly to her superficial friends about her grueling executive workload, while I stayed awake until dawn, fueled by black coffee, doing the actual heavy intellectual lifting that built her entire reputation. Now the absolute most powerful man in her entire industry was actively publicly validating every single silent sacrifice I had ever made. He was doing it by completely surgically destroying the fake towering empire she had maliciously stolen from my mind. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or sadness for her. I felt the profound, deep, steady calm of a massive, long overdue debt finally being paid in absolute full. Sarah and Brent tried to quietly, frantically back away toward the dark coat check room, desperately wanting to escape the terrifying blast radius of the billionaire's wrath. Sterling instantly noticed their cowardly, pathetic retreat and locked his sharp, terrifying gray eyes directly on them for a brief second. He pointed a firm, accusing finger at the toxic, diamond-draped sister and her heavily leveraged, sweating husband. He loudly and clearly stated that their entire superficial, toxic culture of faking success, chasing hollow status, and relying on massive hidden debt was exactly the kind of pathetic weakness that actively destroys great companies from the inside out. He used them as a direct, glaring example of the exact disease he was currently violently purging from his executive board. Brent turned a sickening pale white, completely terrified that the billionaire somehow knew about his failing real estate business, and Sarah looked down at her expensive shoes, completely, utterly humiliated. Sterling slowly turned his intense, terrifying attention back to Caroline. She was trembling visibly now, her perfectly manicured hands clutching the silk sides of her expensive dress in pure, unadulterated terror. The arrogant, dominant woman who had tried to force me to sign a predatory, ruthless post-nuptial agreement just 20 minutes ago was completely gone. She made one final, incredibly pathetic, desperate attempt to save her lucrative job and her stolen status. She openly begged for a second chance, pleading for the opportunity to prove her actual worth to the massive firm. She frantically promised to work twice as hard to stay late every single night and to finally learn the complex foreign languages necessary to do the job she was already being paid millions to perform. Sterling looked at her with eyes that resembled cold, chipped winter ice. He told her with absolute chilling finality that the cutthroat international business world does not pause or wait for exposed frauds to finally catch up to reality. He did not offer her a demotion, a probationary period, or a graceful, quiet exit strategy. He prepared to deliver the ultimate, absolute final blow to her entire existence, with a voice entirely devoid of any human mercy or professional courtesy. He told her that her lingering physical presence in this lobby was actively, dangerously interfering with highly confidential elite corporate negotiations. He stated clearly that the dense foreign documents resting on the marble table contained massive, sensitive global market strategies that completely far exceeded her limited intellectual capacity. He looked directly at the woman who had just proudly, publicly humiliated me on a bright stage in front of 200 wealthy corporate peers, and he told her she lacked the basic intellectual clearance to even breathe the exact same air as the true architect who was about to save his global company. He pointed his hand firmly toward the massive glass front exit of the country club. He ordered her to turn around, walk out those doors, and leave the premises immediately. He explicitly stated that she was officially permanently terminated from the firm effective at this exact second, and that her corporate security badge had already been digitally deactivated. He told her that if she ever attempted to contact his executive board or step foot inside his corporate headquarters again, he would personally ensure she faced massive federal fraud charges for deliberately falsifying years of highly sensitive corporate documents. The absolute finality of his brutal command echoed sharply off the marble walls. There was absolutely no room for debate, no sympathetic human resources department to cry to, and absolutely no corporate ladder left for her to ruthlessly climb. Caroline opened her mouth to speak, to offer one last desperate plea, but her throat was completely tightly closed with sheer shock and overwhelming terror. No sound came out. The two massive, muscular security guards who had been standing quietly in the dark shadows suddenly stepped forcefully forward into the light. Just moments ago, Caroline had proudly, maliciously ordered these exact same men to physically grab my arms and violently throw me out into the cold street. But the power dynamic in the room had completely, permanently shifted. The guards were no longer looking at me. They were looking directly, intensely at Caroline, waiting for Sterling's final signal to physically grab the disgraced former vice president and forcefully drag her out of her own lavish celebration party. She slowly turned her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were wide with a desperate, frantic, pleading expression. The same arrogant, ruthless woman who had actively plotted to steal my 2 children and leave me completely homeless was now silently, desperately begging me to intervene and save her life. She wanted me to use my newly acquired, immense, unshakable leverage with the billionaire to graciously protect her job and save her from total public ruin. She desperately hoped that the quiet, loyal, submissive husband she had emotionally abused for 8 years would step forward and shield her from the massive consequences of her own toxic greed. I looked back at her with the exact same cold, unfeeling, blank expression she had given me for the past 2 brutal years. I did not raise my hand to stop the security guards. I did not utter a single forgiving word in her defense. I stood perfectly still and offered her absolutely nothing. My total, absolute silence was the final, devastating nail driven deeply into her corporate coffin. I slowly and deliberately turned my back on her, completely erasing her from my future. I placed my hands firmly back onto the complex Mandarin and German contracts, actively, eagerly choosing to build my new massive empire over the ashes of her falling ruins. The sound of her expensive designer heels clicking slowly, heavily, and awkwardly across the polished marble floor marked her absolute, total defeat. She did not walk with the graceful, triumphant, proud stride of an untouchable corporate queen anymore. She walked with the heavy, dragging, broken steps of a pathetic woman who had just permanently lost every single valuable thing in the entire world because of her own blinding vanity. Sarah and Brent quickly, nervously followed right behind her, rushing through the heavy glass front doors, and escaping into the freezing, dark night air without ever looking back. The grand luxury lobby was finally completely, permanently purged of their toxic, superficial noise, leaving behind nothing but the quiet, steady, undeniable hum of true, absolute, unshakable power. Richard Sterling did not hesitate for a single second after I laid out my aggressive terms. He reached deep into the pocket of his heavy, custom-tailored overcoat and pulled out his highly secure, encrypted mobile phone. He bypassed his entire elite legal team, his nervous board of directors, and the fake fraudulent vice president, who was still trembling quietly near the exit. He dialed the direct international line to the overseas conglomerate, holding his breath slightly as the digital rings echoed sharply in the quiet marble lobby. When the call finally connected, he did not offer a standard corporate greeting or attempt to smooth over the incredible tension. He simply stated his name, established his authority, and then immediately handed the glowing device directly to me. I took the phone, feeling the heavy, solid weight of a $500 million corporate empire resting comfortably in the palm of my hand. This was the exact moment I had quietly prepared for during all those long, exhausting nights, sitting at my modest kitchen table. I brought the speaker to my ear, and I did not speak a single word of English. I bypassed their expensive translation software completely and launched directly into flawless, highly aggressive native Mandarin. The absolute shock on the other end of the line was completely palpable. I could clearly hear the sudden frantic shuffling of papers, the dropping of pens, and the nervous, sharp whispers of the Asian executives who suddenly realized their massive linguistic blindfold had just been violently ripped away. They had fully expected to bully a desperate American executive who was completely lost in translation, but instead they were facing a man who understood their language better than they did. I did not give them a single moment to recover their balance or formulate a new lie. I systematically dismantled their entire predatory strategy using their own highly complex economic vocabulary directly against them. I confidently cited the specific European environmental liability clauses hidden deep within the rigid German text, flawlessly translating the toxic legal traps into rapid-fire Mandarin. I told them with cold, unyielding authority that we knew exactly what they were aggressively attempting to hide in their failing Eastern European industrial factories. I called their aggressive midnight deadline a pathetic, desperate bluff designed to hide their own massive internal panic. I informed the silent, terrified executives on the phone that their entire massive corporate structure was currently bleeding liquid capital, and they desperately needed our American money just to keep their lights on. I told them that if they did not instantly surrender a massive 20% equity share of their global distribution network to completely offset their hidden toxic debt, we would walk away from the negotiation table forever. I calmly threatened to release our forensic financial findings directly to the international press, which would instantly completely destroy their global stock value by morning. The heavy, suffocating arrogance on their side of the call completely evaporated into thin air. They were completely cornered and entirely trapped by a man they did not even know existed just 10 minutes ago. Within 15 minutes of intense, ruthless, unyielding negotiation, they completely surrendered, agreeing to every single strict financial term I demanded. I secured the massive, lucrative merger, saved Sterling from total, absolute financial ruin, and firmly established my own undeniable dominance on the global stage. I ended the call with a sharp click and handed the phone directly back to the billionaire. Richard Sterling looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated professional awe. He had just witnessed a complete masterclass in high-stakes international warfare, executed flawlessly by a man wearing a cheap, faded 5-year-old suit. He did not offer me a polite congratulatory handshake or a standard empty corporate promise to pay me later next week. He operated on the exact same brutal level of unshakable efficiency that I did. He pulled a slim silver tablet from his leather-bound dossier and quickly accessed his highly secure executive banking portal. He asked me for the specific routing number to my newly formed independent consulting firm. I recited the long string of numbers completely from memory, my voice perfectly steady and calm in the silent lobby. He typed the financial information rapidly into the glowing screen, authorized the massive international transaction with his secure digital signature, and firmly pressed confirm without blinking an eye. My personal cell phone buzzed heavily inside my suit pocket just a few short seconds later. I slowly pulled it out and opened the exact same mobile banking application that had completely terrified me less than an hour ago. The pathetic, humiliating $42 balance that Caroline had so viciously mocked was completely entirely gone. In its place was a massive multi-million-dollar upfront cash retainer resting securely and untouchably in my sole corporate account. The bold black zeros stretched endlessly across my bright screen, representing an astronomical level of liquid wealth that completely dwarfed anything my toxic wife could ever hope to earn in her entire lifetime. I was officially permanently untouchable. The crushing, terrifying financial trap she had meticulously orchestrated with her ruthless divorce lawyers to completely steal my 2 beautiful children was completely destroyed by a single, instantaneous wire transfer. I locked my phone screen and slid it back into my pocket, feeling the immense, unshakable gravity of true, permanent power settling deep into my bones. I had not just survived her brutal attack, I had completely conquered her entire universe. Caroline was still standing frozen near the heavy glass front doors, entirely surrounded by the imposing muscular country club security guards. She had watched the entire breathtaking multi-million-dollar transaction unfold right in front of her terrified eyes. She had heard me speak the exact same complex Mandarin tones I had patiently, rigorously taught our young children for years, while she ignored us to chase hollow status. She had watched the legendary billionaire chief executive officer instantly transfer a massive fortune directly into my private account, showing me the ultimate level of respect she had desperately craved her entire life. Richard Sterling slowly turned his sharp, terrifying gray eyes back toward her fragile, shaking figure, and the temperature in the grand marble lobby plummeted once again. He was absolutely not finished completely burning her fraudulent paper empire to the absolute ground. Sterling told her in a heavy, deep voice that carried absolute chilling finality that her termination from his global company was not just going to be a simple, quiet firing. He officially announced loudly enough for the security guards to hear that her highly publicized promotion to Vice President of Acquisitions was completely permanently revoked, pending a massive, aggressive, internal corporate fraud investigation. He stated clearly with cold, surgical precision that his elite team of corporate lawyers would be tearing violently through every single email, every single digital time card, and every single confidential document she had ever submitted during her entire 8-year career at the firm. He wanted to know exactly how deep her web of lies actually went, and he was going to use his infinite legal resources to completely expose her. Sterling told the trembling woman in the $3,000 designer dress that they were going to meticulously calculate exactly how much unearned executive bonus money she had fraudulently stolen from the firm by falsely claiming my towering intellect as her own original work. He promised her with absolute terrifying conviction that when the forensic accounting was finally complete, his ruthless lawyers would aggressively pursue her in federal civil court to completely recover every single stolen penny she had ever deposited. She was not just losing her lucrative, powerful job tonight in front of her peers. She was facing total, absolute legal and professional annihilation. Sterling explicitly told her that her reputation in the financial district was permanently destroyed and she would never work in any corporate sector ever again. She was officially a toxic radioactive liability, and he was going to make sure every single major employer in the country knew exactly what a massive fraud she truly was. The devastating, crushing reality of her completely unfunded existence finally crashed down heavily upon her shaking shoulders. I watched her perfectly manicured hands tremble violently as her wide, panicked eyes darted frantically around the lavish country club lobby. She was suddenly terrifyingly awake to the absolute nightmare she had arrogantly created for herself. For the past 3 long years, she had been aggressively building a towering, highly leveraged, luxurious lifestyle based entirely on the false assumption that she would always have unrestricted access to my invisible ghostwriting labor and a massive, steadily increasing executive salary. She had secretly taken out massive predatory loans just to purchase her shiny luxury imported cars, so she could aggressively show off to her superficial friends. She had maxed out multiple exclusive high-interest credit cards just to buy her expensive silk designer dresses, her heavy diamond earrings, and her lavish spa treatments. She had aggressively pushed us to buy the massive, expensive family house purely because she desperately needed to project the perfect, flawless image of a wealthy, powerful, untouchable corporate queen to her toxic sister Sarah and her failing brother-in-law Brent. But the ruthless banks and the aggressive credit card companies did not care about her perfect, polished social image. They only cared about real liquid capital, and her capital was now completely permanently gone forever. Without her massive, fraudulent corporate salary, she could not even afford to pay the basic monthly maintenance fees on her ridiculous luxury vehicles. The exclusive elite country club memberships she valued significantly more than her own marriage and her own children would be instantly, permanently canceled the exact moment her credit cards inevitably declined next week. The massive, beautiful house she had just aggressively tried to forcefully steal from me in the predatory post-nuptial agreement was about to instantly become a suffocating, heavy financial anchor that would drag her directly down into brutal, inescapable bankruptcy. She had tried to lock me out of my own life and leave me completely penniless. But instead, she had just accidentally locked herself inside a burning building with absolutely no exits. She was standing completely alone in a massive room full of sparkling crystal chandeliers and expensive imported marble, completely drowning in toxic hidden debt that she could never possibly repay in 10 lifetimes. Her wealthy, sycophantic friends, who were currently drinking expensive champagne in the ballroom next door, would completely abandon her the very second they realized she was broke and disgraced. She was entirely, completely alone. She looked down at her expensive designer shoes, completely unable to hold her head up, and then looked slowly back up at me with tears of pure terror welling in her eyes. The arrogant, dominant, cruel woman who had stood proudly on that bright stage just 1 hour ago, openly calling me a worthless failure in front of 200 people, was entirely, completely gone. She was replaced by a pathetic, hollow, broken shell of a person who had just violently lost the only valuable asset she ever actually possessed. She had deliberately chosen the fake, flashy illusion of superficial success, and it had left her with absolutely nothing but massive debt and total public humiliation. I had chosen the quiet, rigorous hard work of true, unshakable competence, and it had just handed me the entire world. I did not say a single parting word to her. I did not offer her a polite nod of forgiveness or a sympathetic glance of pity. I simply adjusted my crisp suit jacket, turned my back on her complete, absolute destruction, and walked confidently out of the grand lobby doors to begin building my new, unshakable empire. As I stepped out into the cool, crisp night air, the heavy, suffocating weight of the past 8 years completely lifted off my chest forever. I took a deep, cleansing breath and looked up at the bright city lights shining against the dark sky. I was no longer the invisible husband trapped in the shadows of a toxic marriage. I was the founder and lead architect of my own multi-million-dollar international consulting firm. But more importantly than the massive wealth sitting securely in my bank account, I was finally completely free to be the father my children truly deserved. I thought about my 2 brilliant kids waiting safely at home, diligently practicing their language lessons. I knew with absolute certainty that I was going to secure full, permanent legal custody of them tomorrow morning. With my new massive financial resources, and Caroline completely ruined facing federal fraud charges, she would never be able to afford a lawyer to fight me in family court. I was going to show my children the entire world. I was going to take them to Europe so they could speak perfect German and Italian in the real streets, and I was going to take them to Asia so they could negotiate their own futures in flawless Mandarin. I had willingly accepted the rust, the dirt, and the quiet hard work in the background while my wife aggressively chased the hollow, flashy illusion of power. Her fake glass castle had completely shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces, but the solid concrete foundation I had patiently built for my family was completely unshakable. The ultimate public humiliation had not destroyed me at all. It had simply provided the perfect spark I desperately needed to burn away the toxic lies and forge a real, permanent empire of my own. 3 weeks had passed since that defining night at the country club. The passage of time felt entirely different now. For 8 long years, I had lived my life in a constant state of suffocating compression. I had shrunk my existence down to the smallest footprint so my wife could take up all the oxygen. Now I was breathing freely. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new corner office on the 30th floor of a sleek glass building in the financial district. The city sprawled out below me, a vast network of moving cars and bright lights. I held a cup of black coffee watching morning traffic flow through the concrete canyons. I was no longer the invisible husband trapped in a modest house writing brilliant proposals in the dark. I was the founder and chief executive of my own independent international consulting firm. Richard Sterling had kept his promises. The massive retainer had cleared into my corporate account before the sun even came up that next morning. The complex merger with the overseas conglomerate was running smoothly, devoid of the toxic environmental liabilities I surgically removed. My new firm was already fielding desperate phone calls from 3 other massive global corporations who had heard rumors about the architect who saved Sterling from total disaster. My professional life had exploded into undeniable success overnight. But the profound peace I felt standing in my new office had nothing to do with the millions of dollars currently sitting securely in my bank accounts. It came from the absolute unshakable certainty that my 2 children were safe. I used my newly acquired resources to retain the most aggressive family law firm in the state. When my attorneys filed the emergency custody petitions, they presented undeniable evidence detailing Caroline's corporate fraud and collapsing financial stability. The family court judge did not hesitate. I was granted full custody of my children, ensuring they would never be used as leverage in a psychological war again. They were safe, insulated from the destruction of their mother's fabricated life. While my foundation was poured in concrete, Caroline's hollow empire had completely imploded. The speed of her absolute destruction was truly breathtaking to witness from a distance. Richard Sterling was not a man who made empty threats. The morning after the country club incident, his team of corporate lawyers and forensic accountants descended on her department like starving wolves. They tore apart every document she had submitted during her career. The fraud investigation was swift, brutal, and public within the financial district. She was officially terminated, and the firm immediately filed civil lawsuits to recover the executive bonuses she had stolen. But the loss of her job was only the first domino to fall. Caroline had built her entire towering, luxurious lifestyle on a highly fragile foundation of aggressive, toxic debt. She had taken out predatory loans and leveraged every asset we owned to maintain the shiny illusion of immense wealth. The very second her massive executive salary was officially severed, the ruthless banks immediately called in all her outstanding loans. The imported luxury cars she used to show off to superficial friends were quickly repossessed in the middle of the night. Her exclusive elite country club memberships were permanently revoked when her high-interest credit cards inevitably declined. The banks initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings on the expensive house she tried to forcefully steal from me. She was left with nothing but catastrophic debt she could never repay in 10 lifetimes. And just as I had quietly predicted, her toxic, superficial support system vanished the exact moment the money ran out. Sarah and Brent, the sister and brother-in-law who proudly ambushed me, completely abandoned her. Brent's failing commercial real estate business collapsed under the weight of his hidden second mortgages. Sarah was entirely consumed by her own massive financial ruin, and they completely cut all ties with Caroline, refusing to return her desperate phone calls or offer her a place to sleep. The people who worshipped the false idol of status always run away when the gold paint finally chips off to reveal the cheap rusting metal underneath. I finished my coffee and placed the ceramic mug on my solid oak desk. It was time to head downstairs for a lunch meeting with a new prospective international client. I put on my tailored suit jacket, adjusted my tie, and walked out of my office suite toward the private elevator. The smooth descent to the ground floor took seconds. I walked across the polished granite floor of the lobby and pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors into the crisp autumn air. The downtown sidewalk was crowded with professionals rushing to midday appointments. I turned toward the high-end restaurant down the block, but my steady stride came to a halt. Standing near the stone planter, right outside the main entrance of my building, was a figure I almost did not recognize. It was Caroline. She was pacing nervously, rubbing her arms against the chill of the wind. The contrast between the woman standing in front of me and the arrogant corporate queen who publicly executed my pride 3 weeks ago was incredibly stark. She was not wearing a $3,000 designer silk gown. She wore a faded trench coat that looked slightly too large and a simple pair of flat shoes. Her perfectly styled hair was pulled back into a messy, uneven knot, and the heavy, expensive diamond earrings were completely gone, likely pawned to afford basic groceries or a cheap motel room. Her face looked exhausted, drawn, and deeply pale, entirely stripped of the arrogant, smug radiance that used to define her entire personality. She looked like a completely hollow shell of a human being, a woman who had spent her entire existence desperately trying to be someone else and was now left entirely empty. She stopped pacing the second she saw me walk out of the building. Her eyes widened and a desperate, frantic energy immediately took over her exhausted body. She took a quick, hesitant step forward, closing the physical distance between us on the busy public sidewalk. "Thomas," she called out, her voice shaking and incredibly fragile. "Please wait just a minute. Please." I stood perfectly still on the concrete pavement and looked at her with a calm, steady, unreadable expression. I did not feel a sudden surge of angry, vindictive triumph. I did not feel the burning desire to shout at her or publicly humiliate her the way she had done to me. I simply felt the cold, quiet, absolute reality of a finished chapter. She stepped closer, and I could see the genuine, desperate tears actively welling up in her eyes. "Thomas, I have absolutely nowhere else to go," she said, her voice breaking into a pathetic sob. "I lost everything. They took the cars, they took the house, and the lawyers are threatening to completely ruin me. Sarah will not even answer the phone when I call her. I have $20 to my name, and I have been sleeping on a terrible couch in a cheap weekly motel." She reached her shaking hand out as if she wanted to touch my suit jacket, but she stopped herself. Hovering her fingers in the cold air, she looked up at me with a desperate, pleading expression and tried to leverage the one thing she thought might still hold some emotional power over me. "We were married for 8 years, Thomas. We built a whole life together. I know I made terrible, unforgivable mistakes. I know I was blinded by the money and the corporate titles, but I am still the mother of your children. Please, I am begging you for a second chance. I just need a small lifeline. I heard about your new consulting firm. I know you are handling massive global accounts now. I can help you. I can work for you as an assistant or a project manager. I will do the grunt work. I will do whatever you tell me to do. Just please do not leave me out here to completely drown. I can change. I promise you I can be the partner you always wanted me to be." Her words tumbled out in a frantic, pathetic rush of pure desperation. She was actively offering to become the exact same invisible background character she had forcefully turned me into for almost a decade. She was perfectly willing to completely surrender whatever tiny shred of dignity she had left, just to regain access to the massive financial security I now commanded. I listened to her entire desperate plea without interrupting her once. I let the cold autumn wind sweep through the busy city street, carrying the sounds of distant traffic and rushing pedestrians. When she finally stopped talking completely out of breath and crying openly on the sidewalk, I looked her directly in the eyes. My voice was incredibly calm, deeply steady, and entirely surgical. I told her that she did not miss our marriage, and she certainly did not miss me. I told her she only missed the invisible safety net that allowed her to play a dangerous high-stakes game without ever having to face the actual brutal consequences of failure. I explained with absolute quiet clarity that true partnerships are built on a foundation of mutual respect and unshakable loyalty, not on the parasitic extraction of someone else's intellectual labor. "You do not want a second chance, Caroline," I said, my tone perfectly level. "You just want a new host to attach yourself to, because your hollow empire finally collapsed and you completely forgot how to survive in the real world on your own merits." I calmly reached into the slim leather briefcase I was carrying. I opened the brass clasp and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. It was the exact same heavy legal folder that her toxic sister Sarah and her arrogant brother-in-law Brent had aggressively shoved into my chest in the country club lobby 3 weeks ago. I held the thick document out and placed it directly into her shaking hands. She looked down at the paper, completely confused, her tears temporarily stopping as she read the bold legal title printed on the front page. It was her own ruthless, highly predatory post-nuptial agreement. The exact same legal document she had maliciously commissioned her expensive divorce attorneys to draft when she thought she was an untouchable corporate titan and I was just a worthless, unemployed failure. I looked at her pale, shocked face and delivered my absolute final words. I told her that I had thoroughly read all the complex financial clauses she had designed to completely strip me of my dignity and my legal rights. I told her it was a beautifully ruthless contract perfectly engineered to protect the wealthy dominant partner from the financial burdens of the discarded weaker spouse. I pulled a polished silver pen from my inside jacket pocket and handed it to her. I told her that I would gladly sign every single page of this exact agreement right here on the public sidewalk. I explained that I would enthusiastically waive any and all claims to her current non-existent assets, because my own personal net worth now completely and astronomically dwarfed hers. I told her the agreement perfectly permanently severed our financial ties, leaving her entirely responsible for her own massive, catastrophic debts. I told her to take the signed papers back to her expensive lawyers if she could still afford to pay their hourly retaining fees. I did not wait for her to respond. I did not wait to watch her cry. I turned my back on the completely broken illusion of my past and walked confidently down the busy city street toward my new future. The final gavel fell in the quiet family courtroom exactly 2 months after the disaster at the country club. The heavy wooden sound echoed off the high ceilings, marking the official and permanent end of my marriage. I sat at the polished plaintiff table wearing a brand new tailored suit that matched the immense success of my rapidly growing consulting firm. Across the aisle, Caroline sat completely slumped in her chair. She wore a faded plain blouse that looked entirely out of place on a woman who used to obsess over luxury designer labels. Her expensive, aggressive legal team was completely gone, replaced by a single, overworked public defender she barely spoke to. When the judge formally reviewed the massive mountain of undeniable evidence detailing her severe corporate fraud, her catastrophic hidden debts, and her complete lack of any stable income, the final decision was incredibly swift. I was awarded full, permanent legal and physical custody of our 2 children. Caroline did not even attempt to argue or fight back. The fierce, arrogant woman who had once confidently threatened to drag me through a brutal custody battle and leave me homeless was now completely hollowed out by her own catastrophic choices. She did not look at me as the bailiff dismissed the court. She just stared blankly at the floor, finally realizing the absolute permanence of what she had destroyed. I walked out of the downtown courthouse and stepped into the bright, warm afternoon sunlight holding the hands of my 2 incredible children. They were not scared or confused by the legal proceedings. I had been completely honest with them, shielding them from the toxic adult warfare while assuring them that our family foundation was completely secure. My son looked up at me with a bright, genuine smile and asked where we were going next. I looked down at him and felt a massive, overwhelming wave of profound peace wash over my entire being. For 8 incredibly long years, I had confined my entire world to our modest house and our small kitchen table, intentionally shrinking my own existence so their mother could chase a fake corporate crown. I had spent thousands of rigorous hours carefully building their brilliant young minds, preparing them for a massive global future I was secretly afraid I would never actually get to share with them. But standing there on the concrete steps of the courthouse, completely free from the suffocating weight of my toxic past, I realized the entire world was finally completely open to us. I squeezed his hand tightly and told him we were going everywhere. The incredible success of my newly formed independent consulting firm provided me with an astonishing level of absolute freedom. By successfully securing the $500 million international merger for Richard Sterling, I had instantly established my reputation as the most brilliant, untouchable strategic architect in the global financial district. Massive multinational corporations were actively competing for my time, offering astronomical retainers just to have me review their overseas portfolios. But I firmly refused to ever be chained to a corporate desk again. I structured my firm to be completely remote, hiring a small elite team of dedicated analysts to handle the daily logistics, while I maintained absolute total control over my own schedule. I was no longer the invisible ghostwriter hiding in the dark. I was a sovereign, independent force generating massive wealth strictly on my own terms. And I decided to use that immense absolute freedom to give my children the greatest educational experience of their entire lives. We packed our bags, rented out the house, and began traveling the globe. The grueling thousands of hours we had spent sitting at our kitchen table, running through intense language drills, finally transformed from abstract academic lessons into beautiful living reality. Our first major stop was Europe. I will never forget the profound, overwhelming pride I felt standing in a crowded historic square in Munich, Germany. We were surrounded by towering ancient architecture and the loud, bustling noise of the local morning market. My children walked right up to a traditional vendor and confidently ordered our breakfast in completely flawless, perfect German. The elderly vendor was so incredibly shocked and delighted by their precise grammar and their perfect local accents that he gave them extra pastries, completely free of charge. I stood a few feet away watching my kids laugh and effortlessly connect with people from a completely different culture. They were not just reciting memorized phrases from a textbook. They were actively, deeply engaging with the world entirely on their own terms. A few weeks later, we traveled south down into Italy, settling into a beautiful rustic villa overlooking the rolling hills of Tuscany. The warm, golden sunlight spilled across the ancient stone walls as we spent our afternoons exploring the rich local history. I watched my children easily navigate the winding cobblestone streets of Florence, speaking beautiful, fluent Italian to the local artisans and museum guides. They asked complex questions about Renaissance art and ancient Roman architecture, completely immersing themselves in the deep, vast history I had always promised them they would one day see. While Caroline had spent her entire miserable life desperately trying to buy fake Italian designer handbags to impress superficial strangers, my children were actively casually speaking the native language and earning the genuine deep respect of the actual Italian people. They were building real, authentic human connections that no amount of stolen corporate money could ever possibly buy. But the absolute greatest triumph of our global journey happened when we finally flew across the world to Asia. We spent a month navigating the massive, towering, hyper-modern cities of Singapore and Taipei. This was the ultimate rigorous test of the strategic foundation I had so carefully, painstakingly built for them. I had rigorously pushed them to master the incredibly difficult tonal pronunciations and the complex written characters of Mandarin, because I knew with absolute concrete certainty that it was the dominant language of the future global economy. Watching them use it in the real world was absolutely breathtaking. We walked through a massive, chaotic night market glowing with bright neon signs and completely packed with thousands of rushing people. My children seamlessly, effortlessly switched their brains into Mandarin, gracefully negotiating with local merchants, asking for specific directions, and translating complex historical plaques for me as we visited ancient, stunning temples. During a high-stakes lunch meeting I arranged with a massive Asian technology firm, my kids sat at the table and politely, casually conversed with the billionaire executives in perfect, respectful Mandarin. The wealthy, powerful overseas leaders were absolutely mesmerized by my children. They saw the exact same towering intellect and rigorous, disciplined foundation that Richard Sterling had recognized in me. They realized immediately that my family commanded a level of deep, genuine competence that completely transcended basic borders and cheap, superficial business suits. My kids did not need to wear $3,000 designer clothes or brag loudly about fake executive titles to command absolute respect in that room. Their quiet, undeniable brilliance spoke entirely for itself. I sat at the head of the table watching my two beautiful children confidently navigate the most complex strategic language in the world, and I knew in my heart that my 8 long years of quiet, invisible sacrifice were absolutely entirely worth it. As we traveled from country to country, I found myself frequently reflecting on the brutal, painful journey that had ultimately led me to this beautiful, vibrant life. Sometimes late at night, while my kids were sleeping peacefully in our hotel rooms, I would think back to that suffocating formal dinner at the country club. It felt like an entirely different lifetime ago. I thought about Caroline standing proudly bathed in the golden spotlight, wearing a dress she bought on credit, loudly declaring to 200 wealthy sycophants that I was a complete worthless failure who had never accomplished a single meaningful thing. She truly believed that success was a physical object you could simply steal, wear, or print on a fancy corporate business card. She believed that power was just an illusion you could desperately, violently force other people to believe in. She was completely, utterly wrong. The core fundamental lesson I learned through all the humiliation, the quiet, invisible labor, and the ultimate massive, explosive vindication is that true, genuine wealth is never built on designer labels, luxury cars, or hollow corporate titles stolen from the minds of other people. Those things are just cheap, fragile glass ornaments easily shattered by a single strong gust of wind. True, absolute wealth is built entirely on unshakable competence, deep, endless patience, and a rigorous internal foundation that simply cannot be faked or taken away. It is the quiet, relentless hard work you do in the dark when nobody else is watching. It is the thousands of hours you spend building your own intellect and nurturing the minds of your children. Real power is the absolute quiet certainty of knowing exactly what you are genuinely capable of producing completely out of thin air, regardless of what toxic, arrogant people try to say about you. Caroline chose the flashy, hollow illusion of success, and the exact second the blinding spotlight was turned off, her entire fake empire violently collapsed, leaving her entirely alone, drowning in catastrophic debt. She built her castle on shifting sand using stolen blueprints, and the moment a real storm arrived, it washed her completely away. I was handed the heavy, exhausting, invisible labor, the quiet shadows, and the brutal public humiliation. But I used that painful isolation to patiently, meticulously pour a massive foundation of solid, unshakable concrete. When the storm finally hit, my structure did not move a single fraction of an inch. It simply stood tall and completely broke the wind. I did not need to seek petty, vindictive revenge against the woman who betrayed me, because the absolute, devastating reality of the real world naturally destroyed her fragile illusion completely on its own. Today my life is completely, beautifully unrecognizable from the dark, suffocating existence I endured for 8 years. I am a deeply respected international consultant, a wealthy, independent business owner, and a completely free man. But my greatest permanent title will always be a father. I spend my days exploring the vast, incredible world with my 2 brilliant, trilingual children, watching them confidently conquer every single obstacle in their path. We practice our languages, we study global markets, and we continue to rigorously build the immense, unshakable empire of our own family legacy. I walked completely away from a highly toxic, suffocating environment where my massive, immense value was completely ignored and maliciously exploited. I took all the heavy, raw materials of my own brilliant mind, and I built a genuine, towering kingdom where my children will always be completely safe, respected, and infinitely powerful. If this long, painful, but ultimately triumphant journey resonated with you and reminded you of your own hidden strength, please take a moment to smash that like button. Share this video with someone you know who is currently feeling completely underestimated, unappreciated, or trapped in the dark shadows of a highly toxic relationship. They urgently need to remember that their quiet current struggle is just the meticulous groundwork for their own massive, undeniable comeback. Drop a comment below right now and tell me about a specific time in your own life when you finally confidently walked away from a highly toxic environment to boldly build your own unshakable empire. Let us build a strong community of people who value true, authentic competence over fake, flashy illusions. And please do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more incredible stories about uncovering the brutal truth, fighting back against arrogant, toxic narcissists, and turning absolute rock bottom into an untouchable global empire.